I've been working on this conference for about a year, it seems like, and it's just wonderful to see it come to fruition today. Such an event doesn't get off the ground without an awful lot of help, and I'd like to say especially that I'm grateful to our steering group, which includes Elise Jerry, and Whit Gully, and Ron Ruth, and Emily Roshan, and Steve Subrin, as well as many dedicated members of the Northeastern Environmental Law Society, which include Catherine Craig and Ariella Spar and Clark Wheeler, who's here. Could you all stand up just a moment so we can acknowledge all of your work? You have an attendee list in your packets. It's there for networking. I hope you will keep in touch with us and with each other over time. There's our resources section and slides and materials from the conference on the website. I'm happy that the continuing legal education certification has come through for Maine and Vermont. So any of you who are there who would like to take care of that, please be sure you take care of the paperwork out front at registration. Of course, all this isn't without a cost, and so I'll just put in my plug right here up front. If you're in a position to give to the annual fund, we hope you will step up to the plate and do that so we can pursue this kind of programming going forward. It's a really exciting time here at the law school and within the university, where the theme of sustainability has underpinned the expansion of a bunch of important programs and brought me together with many new colleagues around the university. I've been so excited by the synergy of the work of my colleagues here at the law school in related topics like human rights and property rights and governance structures and regulation. I'd also like to say the dual degree program that we have with Vermont Law School that gives students a Master's of Environmental Law and Policy together with their JD has just been the basis of some wonderful collaborations. Melissa Scanlon, the director of the Environmental Law Center there, is here today, and you'll hear from her later. Across the university, I've just been so excited with recent interactions with the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, the Civil and Environmental Engineering folks, the Urban Landscape Design Program and the College of Arts, Media and Design, the sociologists, the Bouvet Health Sciences people, the Marine Science Center folks. These have all been wonderful new colleagues that I have enjoyed collaborating with in things like the sustainability pop-up and the Myra-Craft Open Classroom on water this semester. And we're very excited about launching the Resilient Cities Laboratory, which has been spearheaded by Matthias Ruth, who you'll hear from a little later today. As the breadth of our conversations suggest, the sustainability of a city draws on many kinds of infrastructure and services, air pollution and climate control, water, wastewater, stormwater, food production and supply, transportation and mobility. I'm just delighted to see all of you here to contribute to our conversations on that. And of course, there's no better person to help us launch our attempt to tackle these issues together than our keynote speaker. And I'm going to turn the program over to Jeremy Paul to introduce Carol Brennan.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. And in addition to all the people whom you thank, we should all thank you for the work that you did along with Miel in spearheading this project. You did mention, my name is Jeremy Paul. She said I'm the dean here at the law school, and I'm truly excited to be welcoming you to this conference on lawyering for the sustainable city. We have a story we tell all of our law students from the first day. Your first year legal curriculum is pretty siloed, right? You have a contracts class and a torts class and a property class. But when a client walks into your office, they don't walk into your office and say, I have a torts problem, right? They walk in and they tell you a story about something that happened to them. Although, of course, precisely the same thing is true at the broader level. If someone wants to build a bridge or figure out how to improve the energy efficiency of a city or reduce air pollution, they don't walk into your office and say, I have a legal problem or I have an engineering problem. They say, I want to have a new bridge. And so putting people together from multiple disciplines, as this conference does, is much more directly responsive to the human needs that all of us are trying to serve. And so I think this is a terrific thing. I'm also happy to see the focus on cities. James Fallows has in the recent Atlantic Monthly magazine an article about the success of cities and the value of strong mayors as all of us watch Washington politics continue to deteriorate. It's nice to know that there are at least some functioning units of government that are getting things done. And of course the city here in Boston and other large cities around the country had some very successful mayors who've done a lot of great things with help from all the people such as you who work in these fields. And last, I would say that I think one of the side benefits of focusing as intently as we're going to do today on some of the things that we might have to do in order to respond to environmental changes, and in particular climate change. Not only will it help us to do that, but it might actually sort of make more salient what the costs of these things are going to be and spur additional efforts to head some of it off before it might in fact be too late. Now, of course, no one has done more to try to spark the interest of the country and the world in trying to head off environmental danger before it happens than our keynote speaker today, Carol M. Browner. For those of us for whom the Clinton administration is not just history but lived experience, my recollection is that every time then EPA Administrator Browner came on the TV screen, I sort of took a deep breath and said, thank God, right, they're one of the good guys, or good gals as the case may be. And so we're particularly delighted to have her here today. Her current position is that she's a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a group of which she was a founding principal from 2001 to 2008. She is a graduate of the University of Florida, both undergraduate and law school. Before taking her position at the EPA in Washington, she was the Secretary of Environmental Regulation in Florida, where she launched the largest ecological restoration project ever attempted in the United States to restore the natural flow of water to the Everglades. At the EPA, Administrator Browner was responsible for adopting the most stringent air pollution standards in the country's history. She set a fine particle clean air standard for the first time and spearheaded the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as well as the Food Quality Protection Act. And as I said, every time that she came on TV, people's hearts sang. Most recently, she served as assistant to President Barack Obama and director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy, where she oversaw the coordination of environmental, energy, climate, transport, and related policy across the federal government. During her tenure, the White House secured the largest investment ever in clean energy and established a national car policy that included both new automobile fuel efficiency standards and the first ever greenhouse gas reductions. And you managed to get all those things through OIRA, so I congratulate you. Right. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here today. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you all for the opportunity to be here, for the invitation to join this group and to think about cities and sustainability and things like adaptation and maybe if I move away from that, and resiliency. I want to introduce my husband, who has kindly escorted me here today. He actually served 18 years in the United States Congress, elected when he was 25, so those of you who are young, you need to get going. And he looked like he was 14 at the time, and although I didn't know him, he served, back then, he served on the Ways and Means Committee, and for those of you who remember what was once a big part of EPA, the Superfund program, he is the author of the tax provisions that actually set up the funding for the Superfund program. In its day, it was a third of EPA's budget, no longer, but it is always a pleasure to have you join me, dear. And we are very fortunate because we actually now divide our time between Washington, D.C., where we both have businesses and do a lot of nonprofit work, but we divide our time between Washington and Vermont. So we will be leaving here today, taking our grandson who lives in Boston, and spending the weekend up in the mountains of Vermont in the middle of nowhere, hopefully during a little snowshoeing. You heard about my career, and thank you for recognizing all the different things I've done. Before I got to EPA in 1993, when President Clinton was elected, the longest I had kept a job was 2 years. I think that was because I was always looking for that next challenge and trying to figure out what I could do to maybe make my city, my state a little bit better. And it's been such an honor to be able to serve not one but two presidents, and to get up every day and think about how to make our country think about these issues and address these issues and find what I've sort of known for, which are the common sense, cost-effective solutions to what have been long-standing problems. I've had a bunch of titles in my career. I was Secretary of the Environment. I was refinancing a home back in the early 90s, and I wrote down, said occupation, so I wrote down Secretary. And then I wrote down my salary, and this poor woman, the secretary in the bank, looked at me and said, "How do you get paid that much to be a secretary?" Then I moved on to administrator. Trust me, no one has any clue what administrator means, and probably think you're in charge of fixing like the jammed, Xerox machine. When I joined President Obama, he created a new office on climate change and energy. When I joined that office, which is a little unusual to go from having served as a cabinet member. I was the longest serving administrator of the EPA. I served all 8 years of the Clinton administration. Someone was once introducing me and wanted to point out I was the longest serving administrator, and instead they said she's the longest suffering administrator. You run EPA, it has its days. There are those OIRA meetings, those congressional hearings, those government shutdowns. But so when I went to join President Obama, the title I was given, and it sort of harked back to Jimmy Carter, was energy czar. That was the first, title I was given in the press, and that evolved into czarina, and onto my favorite, socialist czarina. And you just wanted to call up the Washington Times and say, what do you not understand about history? How can I explain that we're really more socialist czarina? Actually, apparently, I had these wonderful people who worked for me who researched czarinas to announce that there was never a czarina without a czar. It was all derivative. So my husband became a czar and I was a czarina. What I thought I'd spend just a few minutes talking about today is a little bit of history, and then because I think the history really does shape the debates we're having today about the future of environmental protection, and most importantly about climate change, which I personally believe is the biggest issue the world faces. It touches on everything from what this conference is about, from transportation to food to water, and to just to basic human rights and sort of a just and kind world. For those of you who don't remember, EPA was created by Richard Nixon, and he creates two agencies. Do you know what the other one is? No. Well, yeah, that's. We don't think about that. The big one, it's only funny because it's OMB, which is where OIRA sits. And for those of you who follow the intricacies of rulemaking, OIRA is the part of the federal government that gets to oversee all rulemakings and sign off or not sign off. I spent a lot of hours with OIRA in my tenure. But Richard Nixon creates it, and I think it's important to understand he does this in response to a public outcry. The Cuyahoga River has caught on fire. Some of you probably remember the photos. I was I think in high school, I remember the photos of Randy Newman writes a song about the river on fire. And there's this real moral, ethical, bipartisan commitment. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a bipartisan commitment, and it's a moral and ethical one. And embodied in virtually every one of the major environmental laws is a recognition that we are going to set standards, we are going to base them on the best available science. This is important. The word available is extremely important. And we are not going to limit those standards to what available technology can give you, right? So we're going to push technology. We're going to find better ways to get the answer. And it is really, I think, these basic principles that have allowed us to make the kind of progress we've made. And let me give you two examples that I had the opportunity to be involved in. The first is, and you mentioned them, the standards I set for ozone. Ozone is it's sometimes smog, it's easy. There are two ozone issues. There's the upper ozone and the lower ozone. So the lower ozone is sometimes smog. And then the other issue was the fine particle standard, which was the first ever. And in that case, I was using the authority of the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act, very simple provision, which had been modernized, updated in 1990. In fact, at that point, I was working for Al Gore, the senator, helping to, quote, strengthen the Clean Air Act. And then I found my way to implementing the Clean Air Act, working for Vice President Gore. But the provision is that EPA shall set a public health standard based on the best available science for the most commonly found air pollutants. Now, when you set this standard, it doesn't actually require any industry to reduce its pollution. That all happens through separate individual regulations, sectoral, etc. But that provision is very thoughtful because if Congress recognized best available science, science is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And so the question is there an adequate body of evidence, the weight of the evidence, what is the best available? And EPA, you shouldn't wait for everything to be done. Go ahead and set a standard. An easy way to think about it, when EPA made the decision to ban lead in gasoline, what we understood is it was affecting the health of our children. We couldn't say you're going to lose so many IQ points, but you're not going to lose any. We couldn't do it at that level. But we went ahead and said, you know what, this is a health issue, and there's enough science, there's a body of evidence, we're going to set a standard. So we set these standards for fine particles and the ozone standard, and lo and behold, I was immediately sued. I was sued by a coalition called American Trucking, a coalition of companies who, like I said, they weren't yet required to reduce their pollution because this was just an ambient air quality standard, but they were going to have to. And you know, we knew that, they knew that, everybody knew that. And in fact, I was giving a commencement speech and I got called off the stage. We lost in the lower court. We were in an appeals court, that's the first court of jurisdiction in these cases, and they had decided, I'll give you the Washington Post version of what the court had decided. She did something unconstitutional. The more legal version of it is that this delegation to set this kind of standard, this health-based, best available evidence standard, was a unconstitutional grant of authority from the Congress to the EPA because it was too broad. And the argument was, I was free to pick any number. There were no constraints on the Farrell Browner decision making. So this was the first time this constitutional doctrine had been invoked since, I think, FDR. We were shocked, and we were like looking it up, and this is before Google existed, so looking it up, and we were like going to Westlaw and looking it up. We took an appeal in that court, we went on banc, we lost on banc. That was a whole crazy thing. And so we go to the Supreme Court. And the case is argued on Election Day, 2000, so Gore v. Bush election is going down. It's an unusual case in that the Supreme Court allots 2 hours for the argument. Seth Waxman, President Clinton's final Solicitor General, does the argument. Solicitors don't argue every case for the government. They pick the ones that they think are big. I was obviously there for the arguments. It was kind of a brutal argument, is the only way to put it. And at the end, people who watch the Supreme Court, like, Linda Greenhouse, who writes for the New York Times, or this one who writes for NPR, one thing named Nina Totenberg, who are friends, they say, I don't know, Carol, you won the loss 5-4. I mean, this is, and you're realizing if we lose, we will take down the whole institution of government regulation. It's not going to be unique to the EPA, certainly all the EPA statutes. What we argued was I wasn't free to pick any number, that I was absolutely constrained, that Congress hadn't given me unbridled discretion, that I had to look at the science, I had to look at the weight of the evidence, and if all the science said, you know, from here to here is dangerous, but the weight of the evidence said from here to here is what's dangerous, I was confined to this box. I had to pick within this box. And since it said protect public health with a margin of safety, within this box I could lean towards the more stringent. That was the basic argument that we made. The case was Carol Browner versus American Trucking versus Carol Browner. You know, you heard I went to law school. My parents were proud I had gotten to the Supreme Court. I clearly hadn't gotten there the way they were thinking, that I was arguing a case. I was getting there as a named party in the case. So, and I left office. The election happened. My home state of Florida had a recount. It didn't go the way I would have liked. Left office, and about 3 weeks after I left office, I get a phone call from my former general counsel saying, we won. I went, what do you mean? He goes, you won 9-0. Which was a huge, huge victory. I immediately got myself to a computer and tried to find the case. Carol Browner versus American Trucking versus Carol Browner. No case. Because the Supreme Court has a practice that the day an official like me leaves office, my successor's name is placed on the case. Who didn't really like the opinion. That was the funniest part. So she goes down in the history books, I get written out. I obviously have written Christy Todd Whitman, who's a totally fine person. But this was important in my case. But it becomes this very, very important case, because what you've done is you've upheld the fundamentals, right? Which is protect public health, do it with a margin of safety, recognize that science evolves. When I first proposed these standards, Congress dragged me up over and over and over again to testify. And I'll never forget in one of the hearings, one of the Republicans were in charge and they were all opposed. Probably some of the Democrats were opposed too, but since they are in the minority, they were sort of having to be on my side. And they said, one of the Republican members said, well, Ms. Brown, I just discovered that Harvard is still studying the health impacts of fine particles. So how dare you set a standard? And you're like, well, yeah, but that's what Harvard's going to do forever. And, you know, if I don't set a standard now, but, you know, they were so certain that if an issue was still being studied, you couldn't address it. And, you know, what we know today and what the science tells us is when these standards weren't well justified. In fact, they're trying to tighten them now. EPA has proposals to tighten them because there's more science, and that's how the process works. But secondly, that you know, that the policymaker, there's a role for science in informing the policymaker. There's the law that informs the policymaker, and there's the science. And that if we don't make these decisions, we will probably never make them if we wait for all of the science to do that. The second argument in the case, which is an important argument, was that if I did have unbridled discretion, which is what they were arguing, I could have fixed it. And the way I should have fixed it, limited my own decision making, wasn't by the science, right, which is what I did, because that's what I thought the law said. It was by an economic analysis, a cost benefit. I should have looked at how much it would cost industry to comply with the reduction targets and what the benefits to society would be. And we argued that isn't what the law said. Yes, we did a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, we made it publicly available and people could comment on it. But it isn't what the law said. Now, in the case of the fine particles, we had dramatic benefits. And the reason is fine particles contribute to premature deaths in elder Americans. These are little tiny things that become embedded in their lungs. They can't spit them up, you know, and they die earlier than they otherwise. So one of the most bizarre debates I found myself in my career was, what is the value of human life? Literally, what is the dollar amount you assign to human life? There is a school of thought that because someone is older, their life should be, quote, discounted. And when I was testifying, this was an issue that came up, and I got asked a question by an opponent of my proposed regulation or standards. And he asked it in a very gobbledygook way, because he didn't want to say, why don't you like treat older people as being less valuable? So I said, on live TV, I mean, he asked the question, I said, so what you're asking me is to discount senior citizens' lives. You're saying they're not as valuable. I just want to be clear that that's what you're asking me. And I said, I'm not prepared to do that. I will not do that. And oh, by the way, under your scenario, Ronald Reagan's life would not have been worth a lot when he became president. I didn't get the question again. Which is not to say we didn't have to argue it in the court. So in the opinion, Scalia, who writes the majority opinion, right, so he clearly doesn't like this authority. He agrees I've done exactly what was right, that it's not a constitutional, an unconstitutional delegation. But he goes on to say, Congress, you should probably rewrite the Clean Air Act and basically add in cost benefit. One of the things we did as I was leading EPA is we looked back at the history of the Clean Air Act, and we looked at what all the costs to industry have been to achieve pollution reduction targets and what the benefits to society. The costs have been incredibly lower than industry predicted, and the benefits much higher than the agency predicted. So why are the costs lower? Because guess what? Once you set an environmental standard, you create a market. And when you create a market, you need a new widget, you need a scrubber, you need something to meet the standard. We're smart people. The American people are smart. We find a better, cheaper way to meet the standard. When Congress in 1990 banned chlorofluorocarbons, what happened? I said I was working for Gordon. I was on the floor of the Senate during the debate. People were out there, I mean, thoughtful senators were out there saying, oh my God, we're not going to have refrigeration, we're not going to have air conditioning in our cars. Well, as far as I know, we still all have refrigeration, we still have air conditioning in our cars. When Congress made that decision, it created a market opportunity. Yes, it said no to one chemical, but everyone knew we were giving up refrigeration, and so companies made investments, and they brought a new, now technology that has other issues, but they brought a new technology to the market faster, more cheap than anyone had anticipated. And so when we think about the role of regulations as we think about the issue of climate change, we need to remember the history. We need to remember that when we look at the science, when we have a moral and ethical approach, when we set these standards, not based on an economic analysis, that we will rise to the occasion and we will find a very good solution. So the final story I'll tell, and then I know we're going to open up to questions, is about the Massachusetts versus EPA case, which is the big climate case. Do people remember Tom DeLay? So if you don't remember him, he was a congressman. He most recently was on Dancing with the Stars. He didn't do very well. But he was a congressman, and he was known as Newt Gingrich's, what was he known as? The Hammer. He also prided himself on being a scientist. And he and I, we didn't quite see eye to eye. And the reason he prided himself on being a scientist is he had once been an exterminator. And as an exterminator, one of the things you have to do is called batch chemicals. So you're mixing different chemicals together to achieve dead bugs. So he was a scientist because he had batched chemicals. And we were in a hearing. He was on the EPA Appropriations Committee, and I was the administrator. And the way, they don't do this anymore, but in my day, you literally sat at a table maybe twice as wide as this. You were on top of each other. So I'd be here and the members would be there screaming questions at me, and the room would be a tiny room, standing room only. And I was expected to know a $7 billion budget, 18,000 people, 13 laws, and they could read me the question. And I had to move around and, across this array of responsibility. It was my job, and so I learned it, and I think I did it well. So he starts yelling at me. This is 1993. So climate is on the horizon. Al Gore has written Earth in the Balance, but sort of what the government is going to do is way off. And he says to me, EPA is regulating greenhouse gases. And I'm like, this has gone on for a while. Now he's screaming at me. And I'm like, I finally go, no, we're not. We are doing a lot of scientific analysis. We're trying to understand the problem, which is what we should do. That's part of our job, but we're not regulating it. And then I have this throwaway line, which is, in fact, it's not even clear to us we could regulate it. The words greenhouse gases, climate change do not appear in the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. To which he says, well, I want you to go back and ask your lawyers, and I want you to write me a legal memo. So I said, I'll go back and ask the lawyers. So I go back, and some of you may know John Cannon, he's a law professor at UVA, writes the quote Cannon memo, which says, you know what? Those words don't have to appear in the law. If EPA thinks that a particular air pollutant or category endanger public health and welfare, then you have to regulate them. Not can, you have to. We write the memo, we send it over. A couple years pass, we're leaving office, we update the memo with a new general counsel. He updates the memo because there's some case law we think is interesting. I don't even think about this. Well, fortunately, the state of Massachusetts thought about it. So they get out the memo and they say, we're going to sue EPA because they're not regulating greenhouse gas. And we, Massachusetts, have standing to do this because sea level is going to rise and a big chunk of our economy is tied to sea level, to healthy oceans and the shoreline. Go to the argument, Mass versus EPA. So it's now a different, I'm no longer in office. People like me are shown out. Today our president is shown and a new person arrives. The new people have arrived. They obviously argue against Massachusetts, saying, there's no jurisdiction for EPA to regulate this. The court decides 5-4 that, in fact, EPA, if it determines, if it makes a science finding, yes, can and shall regulate. The Bush administration, the folks at EPA write a science finding, it gets stuck in a drawer somewhere. Lisa Jackson is appointed by President Obama, comes to office. They update the scientific finding. She makes the legal scientific finding that greenhouse gases endanger public health. And this is called the endangerment finding. At which point, because of something in the Mass case, we now have to regulate cars. And you heard we did that. We were able to regulate the first ever standards for greenhouse gases on cars. They've done trucks. What was interesting about that is you had two different agencies who have authority over cars. You had EPA with this greenhouse gas authority and tailpipe authorities, but we weren't going to deal with that. And you have the Department of Transportation that does fuel efficiency. And one of the things I was able to do under the president, with the president's leadership, is for the first time ever, you took two separate legal authorities, two separate laws, two separate agencies, and you wrote one set of requirements for the car companies, which was huge, because usually what would happen is EPA would have theirs, and the transportation would have theirs, and the car companies would be going, we don't know what to do. Now, we were helped by the fact that California has separate authority, and so they were sort of sitting out there saying, well, Carol and Obama don't figure this out, we're coming right at you, car companies, and the car companies were saying, we don't want that. And we eventually made everyone happy. The car companies did not sue the administration. California did not sue the administration. The environmental community did not sue the administration. And the way I've always thought about what we put together, which is called the National Car Program, it lives on and more standards are being set. So now they're up to about 50, I think it's 54.5 miles per gallon by model year 2025, which is huge. I mean, this is all technology enforcing. When cars are going to be really, really different because of this. They're going to be cleaner, they're going to be smarter. But the way I thought about it when we were trying to put the deal together is I had Mick Jagger running through my head. You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. And so what I had to do to find the deal is everyone had to get what they needed. Right? Nobody was going to get what they wanted, but everyone included not just the state of California, not the car companies. Car companies needed certainty and predictability. They needed to have one set of instructions. California needed to have their authority protected. They were being sued by the car companies. We needed to make sure those lawsuits went away. The environmentalists had, their very, very important issues in terms of, cleaner air, and ultimately the consumer. The consumer wanted the cleaner air. They wanted smarter cars, and they wanted to save money every time they filled up at the pump. And so that's what we were able to do. And so I share these two examples because they really now frame what it is we're going to be able to do in terms of setting standards on greenhouse gases. And that's what EPA is about right now. We've done cars and trucks. They're focused on power plants. And I think that as you all think about the issues of sustainability, and particularly as you think about cities, they do have a huge role to play. The standards will get set, they'll be driven by state agencies in terms of the day-to-day implementation. But ultimately, to meet the challenge of climate change, the cities have a really unique role to play. and particularly when it comes to adaptation and resiliency. Think about mitigation as how are we going to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, and that's sort of being driven by EPA and the Clean Air Act. And states will be able to write some of the details of the plans that will work within each individual state to meet whatever the standards are that EPA sets, in terms of what are the reduction targets. But when you think about, and the way I like to think about resiliency and adaptation is that they're opposite sides of the same coin. And so resiliency is how quickly can a city respond to a storm. We know more storms are coming, unfortunately. I mean, I have reams of statistics I can show, but you guys know that. So how quickly could Con Edison get that line back up that took out Lower Manhattan? Now, one thing you can do is you can just put that line higher, right? That power line can go higher, those gas lines can go higher. Gee, but the water might go higher. Alternatively, you can encase it in the material that would allow you to really keep the water out. More expensive on the front end, but the cost to Manhattan of no power in the lower half or lower third of the city. My sister runs a liberal arts college at the Municipal. They had no water for their students. They had to send them home. Huge cost all across the lower part of Manhattan. So the first question is resiliency. What can we do to just respond more quickly to the onslaught? The second is adaptation, the opposite side. And adaptation is really about how do we adapt to the fact that these storms are coming? How can we use nature to try and help us forestall some of the consequences? Again, we need to be mitigating. I'm not setting that aside. A good example of adaptation, Mayor Bloomberg suggested that, you remember there was a lot of focus on Breezy Point. It's a really amazing community of firemen, policemen. It was their weekend homes, sometimes in the family for maybe 2 generations. It is actually a floodplain, and there's probably a reason that they were able to go there because the property wouldn't have been as expensive historically as the Hamptons. And the mayor suggested buying them out, offering them money so that that area could be reestablished as a floodplain and help forestall some of the consequences of storm surge. The complicated issue here, of course, is even if you pay them full market value and you pay them something on top of full market value, it's not enough money to get another beach home. It's not enough money probably to get another weekend home. And so as a society, we're going to have to start to think about if we want to use nature. My hometown of Miami has a messy problem going on. They absolutely positively have been sued by EPA and appropriately so need to rebuild their wastewater treatment plant. It is a disaster. So easy, not easy, but easier to build it where it is. The only problem is everybody knows that's where the storm surges are coming, that's where the sea level rise. But it's very hard for elected officials to say, okay, let's spend an extra $1 billion, let's get out of the floodplain, let's go find a new area, so we're going to have to displace somebody, and let's, commit to spending more money, the effects of which, the benefits of which will only be felt down the road, not today. A very, very hard political. One of my favorite things I did at EPA, and then I will stop, is I did a deal with then Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki. We sued, or we threatened to sue the city of New York over the quality of their drinking water. It was declining. And we said, you know what? You got to fix this. And we got 2 ideas for you. You can build yourself a new drinking water treatment facility. You're going to displace, and of course, they pick impoverished communities inevitably to place these things. Or how about we go to the headwaters that are your drinking water? How about we reach up way far north of the city, way up into the Adirondacks? And how about you protect that drinking water source? You keep the pollution in. And if you'll do that, which means development rights have to be taken away and paid for, et cetera, you're not going to have to build this treatment plant. And that was the deal we were able to do. We were able to prevent the problem rather than treat the problem. And I think more and more, as we think about sustainability, as we think about resiliency, as we think about adaptation, we're going to have to think about how do we prevent the problems, how do we let nature help us do the job. So happy to answer.
Thank you so much. Carol, that was wonderful introduction to the array of issues that we have on the table here. Just to launch our discussion, we've got a small discussion panel here at the front who are going to pitch a few questions, and then we'll open the questions up to the audience more generally. And the folks right here in front in our discussion panel, I'm going to ask each of you to, as you ask your question, to introduce yourselves just briefly. And we'll start with Catherine Craig.
Hi, thank you, Carol. I'm Catherine Craig. I'm at 2L here at Northeastern. I'm currently on co-op in the Environmental Enforcement section at the Department of Justice. So nice to talk to you. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks. So my question pertains to fracking. You mentioned the Safe Water Drinking Act, which you have to spearhead. As you know, that regulation and many other environmental regulations do not apply to hydraulic fracturing.
They once did.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about the current regulatory framework that exists and whether you think it's sufficient and what you think the U.S. government should be doing about it.
So during my tenure at EPA, we did get the Safe Drinking Water Act updated. And it was an important thing to do because this is, I'll get to fracking in 1 second, but what had happened is under, I guess it was Reagan, the Democratic Congress felt like EPA wasn't doing anything, hugely frustrated. So it actually wrote into the Safe Drinking Water Act a list of pollutants and said, EPA, you shall regulate. Actually named them. Now, the problem with a static list is science evolves, and so things like cryptosporidium that had killed 100 people, mostly immune-compromised children in Milwaukee, wasn't even on the list. So I went to Congress and said, look, the list isn't working. I get what you want, but why don't we require EPA to develop a list every 5 years, make that public, and then be bound to regulate those. So you can take advantage of the science, you can update the list. And we were able actually to reach a bipartisan agreement to do that. And it's a much better way to think about. We were also able, for the first time ever, to secure federal funds to make loans to drinking water facilities to upgrade. It's a revolving loan fund. They repay that money and the state retains it and can loan it out again. It's the same type of fund that had been set up under the Clean Water Act for sewer plants but hadn't existed for drinking water. So a pretty important financial tool that the federal government could bring, and most states bond the money so there's a multiplier effect. In that law, we had authority, and it predated even the amendments we were discussing, to regulate underground wells. There were sometimes referred to as underground injection wells, and the reason being is that kind of underground activity, companies putting chemicals down, could impact aquifers, could impact drinking water. So the authority derived from protecting the public's drinking water, but you had to look at the sources of drinking water. So underground aquifers are a significant source. In Nebraska, it's 100% of their drinking water in Florida. And we were, as I was, towards the end of my tenure, we were starting to look at this new, quote, technology called fracking for enhanced oil recovery. It was not about shale gas. We didn't know about the shale gas. It was about going into old oil wells and getting more out of it. Now, normally that's a good thing, right? Because you've already done a lot of damage, and if you do it properly, and we could regulate it. And so we were looking at how we would think about regulating that to ensure that the aquifers, I mean, we had to stay focused on the drinking water side of this, that the aquifers, because that's the law we had. So this is an example, and I'm obviously a Democrat, elections matter. Mr. Cheney got elected and he went to Congress and stripped EPA of its authority. So that's why we are where we are today, which is that EPA cannot regulate fracking in terms of underground activities. It can regulate natural gas production in terms of above ground. So to the degree methane emissions, which are an issue worth thinking about, methane's a very potent greenhouse gas. If we could reduce those methane emissions, that would be important. To the degree that the plant is discharging into a river, lake, or stream, that would be covered under the Clean Water Act, not under the Safe Drinking Water Act. But in terms of what goes on underneath the ground, EPA has basically been stripped of its authority. So the states have stepped in, and the states are attempting to, and some of them have done more than others, to build a regulatory infrastructure. Now remember, it's not just, you know this, you work at the Justice Department, it's not just about setting a standard. It is equally important that people think that standard will be enforced. If they don't believe it will be enforced, they may or may not comply. And I think one of the reasons you had EPA created in the 70s is this recognition that it was hard for states. They were constantly facing this dilemma of jobs, the economy, growing the economy versus protecting the environment. And a set of national standards with maybe state modifications based on local geological or geography could make sense, but nevertheless you needed this national attention. The other way to think about it is EPA can go hire the 10 best engineers in the country to think about how to make sure fracking is done absolutely as safe as possible. 25 states can't hire the 10 best, right? There's only 10. So you're asking the states to take on, and I personally believe EPA authority should be restored. I think there are lots of ways for the states to play a role. Taking things out of the ground is inherently complicated. And I believe there are real benefits from natural gas. I do believe that we are seeing some of the benefits in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think that we need to be careful that we don't, in some ways, lose the opportunities for renewables because of the investments we're making in natural gas. But I think you can do both. But I think that what we have to make sure is it is done in the safest possible manner, and equally important that the standards are enforced. And when I talk to the industry, the guys the big industry guys who are out there fracking, they're very comfortable with EPA regulation. They live with EPA regulation. They have lived with EPA regulation. And what they'll even say off the record is, we don't like the idea of 25 state regulations because we're having to sort through just way too much. We would much prefer a national program. And there is a history in Congress when an industry says to Congress, please regulate me, Congress responds. Now the trick there is you then have to have the other part of the conversation, which is, and regulate stringently enough that it's actually meaningful and provides a level of protection. I think that we may get there where, as right now there are a lot of people in the fracking business, some of them are only operating ones, that will change over time. It will become a much smaller, there'll be fewer companies playing. I think they could ask for it. We could end up in a horrible situation when there's an accident. Historically, Congress has responded to environmental accidents. Lois Gibbs finds toxic drums in her backyard, and you get the Superfund law. Exxon Valdez crashes into Alaska, and you get the double hull requirements. You get all these new requirements in terms of liability for oil spills. The BP well goes tweet. Congress has yet to change the law. They have not responded, despite regular requests from the administration. And just a little footnote, the liability in the oil spill law right now per accident, I think is $75 million. That's what was set after Exxon. That was considered to be a very large number after Exxon Valdez. The first thing I did after the spill was I negotiated a $20 billion agreement with BP for damages, and they will pay more than that. And yet Congress has not changed the $75 million. Everyone knows it's not enough money. So I worry that this history of the public sort of demanding a congressional response, a national response when there's an accident is it may no longer be true, but that would be the worst of all situations if we end up in some situation with an accident. And I think states, look, I ran a state agency. States can do an awful lot of the day-to-day work of permitting and overseeing, but if, in my experience, if you don't have sort of, even as one of the great things to say when you're the state Secretary of the Environment is, EPA is making me do it. That's line in there. And when I got to EPA, I was like, oh, shit. No, sorry. Well, you can't really say that anymore. The law is making me do it.
Thank you. Professor Subrin, I know you have a question. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Steve Shupin, and I teach here. Your position on the value of life for old people is magnificent.
But in some cases, I think we should increase it.
Oh, absolutely.
Beyond the average.
With the gridlock, and you've addressed some of this already, but I'd like to hear more about it. With the gridlock in Washington that seems to be going on, what about the initiatives going on at the city level, and municipal level, state level that you've talked about? Do you see any hope of money flowing from the national level that might help the cities with flood, building requirements, etc.? Or actually, I guess I ask you a federalism question. What do you see in the next 5 or 10 years trying to work out the relationship of the local with the national?
I mean, let's just take 1 minute on what's wrong with what's wrong with Washington, because I think it's important to know. I'm frequently asked what was the biggest difference between being a part of the Clinton administration and being a part of the Obama administration. And two things changed dramatically in the course of that time. One is the role of money in politics. It is, and my husband could comment, how much did you spend when you ran in '74 for your first office?
$45,000.
A friend of ours just ran in Minnesota for a congressional seat. Between the Democrat and the Republican, how much was spent?
$20 million.
Okay. 20 million. Now, the candidates didn't raise it all. Some of it was party money, etc. But the point is, it's a really different world when it takes 45,000 versus 20. Now, not every race is 20. That was a contested race. It was a nationally contested race. It was a Tea Party issue. But the point being, they all cost a lot of money now. And, you know, when a member of Congress calls me, my assistant will come in and go, oh, Senator so-and-so's on the phone. You know, they want to talk to you. And I'm like, could you just go look at the phone number? And if it's not a 224 number, that means they're not calling from their office. They're not calling to discuss policy with me. They want money. It's so bad, I'll just go, take a message, not talking to them. I mean, it's just this cynicism about money. And, you know, that doesn't even get to what's happening, you know, between the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But the money in politics is, people were complaining back about it during the Clinton era. It's just hard to fathom. The second thing that happened is the media has changed dramatically. You know, when I first went to EPA in '93, you know, there was 3 networks. There was PBS, there was the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. I mean, you could get a handle on the news outlets, but more importantly, you could sustain a story in the media over a period of time. So when I was, people, you know, when the Gingrich, they shut EPA down 3 times under my leadership, wouldn't pay our employees, we had to send them home. Out of that, we used that to sustain a conversation with the American people about what EPA does for you. We're the cop on the beat, we're the environmental cop, we're the reason your air is getting cleaner, your water is safe. And we went from being a very unpopular agency to being a very popular agency by having this dialogue. And in fact, it's part of how I was then able to set these really tough pollution standards, take sulfur out of diesel fuel, et cetera, because I had the strength, momentum of the public people behind me. You cannot sustain a conversation with the American people anymore. Literally, the Obama White House, they have media events at 8, they do another one at noon, they do another one at 5. Different issues. And if you can't have your elected officials in this kind of dialogue, and you're very dependent on the media, but the media, they're just looking for what's the headline, you know, he said, she said, move it along, who got killed, you know, whatever. And I think this is really detracting from, you know, our ability to make important decisions. When I was, I can't remember what the issue was, but it was Gingrich had taken power, and I was going on, I was doing a PBS NewsHour, or whatever it was called back then. Yeah, that one. No, I even used to be on it when it was both of their names, Belair or McNeil, whatever. And I had been on many times before, very thoughtful, be me being interviewed about what we were doing. And the producer called back and said, oh, we're getting a lot of pressure from Gingrich's office that we should put the other side on. I don't understand what's the other side. Well, you know, there's not a scientist who says your science is bad. You know what, I'm not coming on, because I'm not giving that person airtime, because this is a bogus conversation. The science is what the science is. I'm happy to debate what you do with that science, and whether or not you spend money to solve the problem. So I think it's important that these have just caused this huge shift in how we all interact with our government. What gives me hope is local government. I think particularly the medium-sized cities are really getting smart about how they think about infrastructure. Now, they get a lot of federal money, but they get it in these bits and pieces, and there's been some efforts over the years to try and kind of lump it together and give them more flexibility. One of the things I did in the drinking water law is said they could take some of the bricks and mortar money that they get and use it to prevent pollution, use it to do like a New York deal. Not many of them have done it, but it's a place where there are some pots of money to do some creative things. I think one of the big debates on the horizon that is worth people, I don't have the answer, but it's worth thinking about and getting some more answers, is the Highway Trust Fund. This is where a huge amount of money moves out of Washington. The Highway Trust Fund is funded by a gas tax. The good news is, under the president's leadership, our cars are going to be more efficient. That's a good thing, because we all breathe. It means there will be less money in the Highway Trust Fund. So what do you do to ensure you have the dollars to build, and flexibility to build new age infrastructure? The state of Virginia, the legislature not always known to be the greenest place in the country. They have a good governor, but the legislature is a little different. Decided that the solution to this was to put a tax on a Prius, right? So rather than encouraging people to do something that works to their benefit because they're using less gas, but works to all of our benefits because it's less pollution, let's penalize them. And I think there's this whole thing coming, we were talking about it earlier in Vermont, it's happening in other states, on net metering, on saying to people who invest in personal solar or wind that somehow that's not fair. So I think as we think about sort of how to help cities, we're going to have to also think about, to your point, funding, and we need to start to think about these issues where we may end up intentionally, I would say, but unfortunately discouraging both the role of the city and the individual in the city in terms of finding solutions. And that means, one idea that's been floated by people, economists, I don't know enough about it to really have an opinion, would be rather than a gas tax or a per gallon tax, is you have something called a vehicle miles traveled, right? And that you could have, say that for the first X number of miles, for low-income people, they didn't pay. There are ways you can structure it. The minute you hear any debate on this, what you hear is about privacy. Like, that means the government's going to know where I went. Well, government already knows where you went because you're using that easy pass, and they can track you as you move around, and that's a convenience. But there might be a way to fix that, right? Which is say, okay, if you don't want to be in the vehicle miles traveled program, we respect that, then you're going to pay a flat fee. And you might find that flat fee offensive because actually your vehicle miles might lead to a lower payment than the flat fee. But I think it's a long way of saying, how do we fund these things? There are tools out there, but we're going to have to, people like me who care about climate change and care about these quality of life issues, we're going to have to think about, where, first of all, the revenues are going to come from, and then secondly, the flexibility in how they're actually spent.
Thank you. Now, I know my discussion panel has a bunch of other fabulous questions, but I think we need to open it up here for some audience discussion. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Rachel Evans with the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, and I think I have a more positive response to Professor Suprin's question. And it has to do with, in Massachusetts, we have a Green Communities Act, which implements our carbon cap and trade program, and which is RGGI. And through that, we receive proceeds for carbon allowances, which we sell at auction. And our legislature has required that those proceeds be invested in energy efficiency and green communities. And so what we have done is we have certain standards that communities are required to meet, and if they can meet them, and that money is used for municipal buildings, it's used for purchasing renewable energy projects. And riding inland on the T this morning, I bumped into my former colleague Emily Roshan there in the front row, and we were posing questions for you. And we were discussing Section 111D of the Clean Air Act.
We'd have to stay for the rest of the day.
And we were wondering whether nationwide, Massachusetts has proposed this model for compliance, and whether we can see how it benefits in Massachusetts. We get a lot of money, we invest in our communities, but then we looked like in Appalachia, and they're so dependent on the coal industry. And could they, within that state, receive enough economic benefits to invest in their own communities? And at that level, we see the federal need to, Emily gave the example of Europe, where some countries are carbon dependent and some aren't, and they have the proceeds going between different countries. And what do you think of that model?
Okay, so very quickly, the BAS versus EPA says to EPA, if greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, you must regulate them. Once EPA did that, once EPA started regulating them from cars, which was the first set of standards, EPA was required to regulate them across all sectors. So they're working their way through the various sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Power plants being the first big stationary source. Cars and trucks being the mobile sources, power plants being the stationary sources. They're using a section of the law, 111D, that has not been widely used. So it's raising a lot of, inevitable legal questions about how to do things. But I was with Gina McCarthy, the head of EPA, just 2 days ago, and she is very, very intent on giving a huge amount of flexibility to states. So basically the way it's going to work is EPA is going to set an emissions target. Probably not on a facility by facility basis, but we don't know, but I would guessing, but on a state by state basis. And then the state will write what's called a state implementation plan. It will say, here's how we're going to meet these emissions targets. There's no money, there's no federal money for this. But one thing that many of us are hoping is that when states look at the tools available to them, whether it's energy efficiency, et cetera, that one of the tools they might look at are things like RGGI, like working together across state lines to set up programs. And as you point out, RGGI generated resources. There's no reason, based on all the legal analysis we've looked at, to think they can't do that. EPA can probably not mandate a cap and trade program. We did set up the asset rain program when I was there, hugely successful. But their authority right now is a little bit different in this section. But that you could build on the great successes of local government and state government to, whether it's a renewable portfolio standard, whether it's RGGI, whether it's energy efficiency, companies like Enernoc based here in Boston, companies like O-Power, demand response. It's a whole set of tools. And EPA will give the states instructions on writing this SIP, the state implementation plan, with a long list of tools. And I wouldn't be surprised if some states say, well, we want to use a trading mechanism. Now, what's going to get interesting in all of this is where industry sits. And so we'll go back to, I'm from Florida. When I grew up, and probably when many of you grew up, there was, in my place, in my state, there was Florida Power and Electric. They made the electricity, they distributed the electricity, they collected the bill from me. It was a vertically integrated. Fewer and fewer companies are vertically integrated. Now you have people making it, you have people distributing it, you have the people selling the retail sale. The Florida Power is a good example. They're no longer called Florida Power, they're now called NextEra. They have facilities all over the country. So if I'm the CEO and I'm saying, okay, I have these requirements, I want to manage across my fleet. I want to make the most cost-effective reduction. So the degree that I, company, whatever, become a voice for regional solutions, right? Because now I can say, I don't have to just manage my facilities in Massachusetts to hit this target. I can manage from Massachusetts to Maine to Maryland, whatever. So I think you're going to see companies playing an interesting role in Section 111D. You're also going to see, and it's already happened, there are 8 states now, some very conservative, there's a group called ALEC, a very conservative I think they're co-funded organization that is going into state legislatures in the same way they did on the healthcare and trying to get laws passed prohibiting the state agency from writing the plan. If the state agency doesn't write this carbon reduction plan, it's not as if nothing happens. EPA then writes what's called a FIP, a Federal Implementation Plan. EPA's list of tools is not this long, it's this long. So that should be an incentive for the states to do it because the states have more tools. EPA can give them more tools than, you don't agree with me?
I think it just sets them up and then they can demonize the evil EPA.
Well, let me tell you what happened in one state. So Virginia, I pointed out, this is the legislature that considered a tax on Priuses. I would have never predicted this. This is why it's interesting. Dominion, who's a fairly by-the-book conservative power company, when a bill was proposed in Virginia to strip the state of its legal authority to write the SIP plan, guess who picked up their hand and said, oh, no, you don't want to pass that law? Dominion. Because you know what Dominion realized? The FIP was worse than the SIP. And they wanted control over the SIP, and they couldn't get control in the same way over the FIP. These are all notice and comment rulemaking, so they have their say. But I actually think you may see it play out differently than, now that doesn't say there won't be a few states who go ahead and just say you cannot spend any state dollars on writing these plans. I suspect there will. But the other thing is, when I take the big picture view of this, what I care about is getting less carbon, less greenhouse gases in the air. That is my, eye on the prize, right? The truth of the matter is not all 50 states generate the same burden into the system. So if 3 or 4 states don't do it, and EPA has to do it, and you're right, they'll demonize EPA. I mean, look, I was a good environmental, I was demonizing EPA in my day, right? When I was a state regulator, saying, oh, it's a state legislator, sorry, I can't help you, and EPA's making me do it. It's a lot easier than giving the argument on why it was the right thing to do sometimes. But I think this is actually, there's an interesting thing about the power plants, who also will not be of a unified mind. So my position, if I own power generating facilities, right, forget about the distribution of everything. If I make electricity, my position on these reduction targets are driven by my fleet makeup. If I'm Exelon and I'm 80% nuclear, bring it on. Drive that reduction target as low as you possibly can, because right now I'm selling electricity that is more expensive to make than the coal-generated electricity. And I would like nothing better than to have a more competitive merchant market. Now, I'm going to do something that's probably heresy in this crowd. I, for many years, opposed nuclear power. I do not anymore, for a very simple reason. It is clean. It is not without its challenges, but guess what? A lot more people have suffered because of fossil fuel energy in this country than have suffered because of nuclear. And so, there's new generation nuclear. I just think that if you believe what I believe about climate change, it is not a consistent position to have. But I'll come back and we'll have a nuclear debate. How's that? But I think so you're setting up this really interesting dilemma here for companies. And again, I'm going to look at my fleet and go, I benefit from this, I don't benefit. I'm going to look at my state and say, you know what? I can walk into the governor's office any day of the week and get what I want versus trying to get into the EPA or the White House. So I think this is going to play out maybe differently. I mean, when I heard about these state laws, I'm like, oh my God, they're all going to pass these laws banning expenditure. But then when I saw what Dominion did, I thought, oh no, there's a whole other way to think about it. Okay, you're in charge.
This is so hard to be in charge at this moment because our time for this session has run out. And yes.
I know we don't have a ton of students here, but we have some, and so I just want to make a special appeal to all of you who are students. And you're here, you're getting this incredible education. You're very blessed to be able to take the time to go to law school and learn. And what I want to do is just encourage you, as you are already doing, to think about public service when you leave here. It is not something that is given the kind of honor I think that it is due these days. Certainly when I left law school, lots of people went to public service. not as many of you choose that anymore, and we're not going to figure these issues out if people like you can't, perhaps find a way to give at least a few years. I have spent most of my life in public service, sometimes actually serving in a government, serving as a staffer in a state legislature, leading environmental groups. I just elected the chair of the League of Conservation Voters. We support green bipartisan support of green candidates. But I will tell you something. The greatest thing I believe in, we tell this to our kids all the time in life, is the idea that you get up every day and you go to work and you think about how to make your town, your city, your state, your country, your world a better place. And that's what public service is. It is that opportunity. And so I just, there aren't many of you, and the rest of you, you've probably done your public service, but I would hope that you would think about a stint in public service. Thank you all very much.
So I don't think there's any need to talk much about sort of the climate change story that Lee sort of wanted me to talk about. I think we all know climate's real. The record's clear. If you look at the emissions trends and changes in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and then you combine this with what we know from climate science, and when you combine this then with observations about policy where really not a lot is happening, it's clear that we're going to face more severe, more frequent, more intense extreme weather events. Climate's already coming, climate change is coming, and there will be a lot more of it. So with this in mind, I actually want to pick up quickly on where Carol left off. She talked about mitigation and adaptation as sort of two of the strategies that we would pursue, and that's clearly the case. Mitigation, cutting emissions; adaptation, preparing ourselves for the climate change that we already committed ourselves to. But there's a third thing that we'll do, and it's suffering, simply to the extent that we don't do enough mitigation or adaptation, and there will be residual risks to which we're not prepared for. So a few quick comments, three quickly, on mitigation trends. Where are we? How well are we doing with regard to our ability to cut carbon emissions? And I want to then move on to talk a little bit also about adaptation and suffering, and then towards the end, very quickly, touch on the broadest theme of this conference or this meeting, namely what cities can do, what cities should do, and where they, what they will face in the near future. So how are we doing on the mitigation front? There's some really excellent research that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences almost exactly a year ago by Glenn Peters of the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research in Oslo. And what he did and his team was not look at carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions country by country or region by region, but through a very intricate input-output analysis attributed all the emissions to the individual countries for which they are responsible for. So it's not just what we admit here, but what we are responsible for in terms of emissions in China, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, wherever it might be. And the findings of that study show that, lo and behold, there is a significant emissions transfer from the developed countries to the less developed countries. So in less technical terms, all of those who have been really good at cutting their emissions have been good by outsourcing their emissions to other places. And there will be a lot more of this to come, especially since we are promoting very aggressively international trade of many of these energy-intensive, material-intensive products. The second quick observation on mitigation is that there's a lot of hope that rests on technology change. Technology will make us more efficient and then help us cut some of the emissions. There's also excellent research that shows that the rebound effects are significant, meaning your car, for example, your Prius is much more efficient than your F-150 might be, or it is. But then you might drive a little more, or you have a better insulated home, and you might set up your thermostat a little bit differently. So there are some behavioral changes that start kicking in that undo some of the gains that come from these efficiency improvements. And again, as long as we don't get a handle on behaviors in combination with technology, there's not a lot we can expect from technology alone. And then third, and what makes it even worse, one of our most dominant economic policy has been for quite a while and still continues to be one that pushes economic growth. And here's the logic. We're told that we need economic growth to create the wealth, to make possible the investments, to help us solve the problems that are created by economic growth. And I'll let this hang there for a minute and I'll come back to this again towards the end of my comments. So if we're looking for especially challenging, this is what Lee asked me, looking for especially challenging aspects with respect to planning, policy, law, and the engagement of civic society, there you already got three. What are the trade regimes that foster comparative advantages in emissions reductions rather than in the production of emissions-intensive products? What kind of incentive mechanisms reduce the emergence of these rebound effects that I've just mentioned? Or what legal frameworks promote policies that generate true wealth, well-being, quality of life, rather than more stuff, more economic growth? So just a few more comments on the topic of adaptation and suffering. Always great crowd pleasers. Mitigation and adaptation are not substitutes. They often are portrayed as such. Well, a little less mitigation now, a little bit more adaptation later. No. Less adaptation, less mitigation now, almost an infinite stream of having to prepare for the climate to which you committed yourself in the infinite future. Serious challenge. But also, what's really important to recognize about those two is it often has been perceived as, well, we can spend our dollar once on mitigation, or we can do it on adaptation, so we'll deal with the root causes rather than building band-aids. There are many strategies where you can do both at the same time. For example, you can decentralize your power grid, use renewable resources, you can therefore have a smaller carbon footprint at the same time at which you become less susceptible to downing of power lines because of extreme weather events. So you have mitigated and you have adapted to the new climate conditions. A second comment on that, mitigation and adaptation, mitigation and suffering, much needed mitigation and adaptation are delayed because of the high perceived cost. There's always something else that we need to do. Crumbling bridges, poor education system, you name it. But if we don't invest in mitigation and adaptation, many of the other investments that we might make will become at higher risks. Right? So mitigation and adaptation are almost like a prerequisite of making sure that the other things pay off the way we want them to pay off. And then last but not least on that topic, you may think of climate change as a threat multiplier or as a need magnifier. There's really nothing that gets better because of climate change. I mean, there might be temporarily some improvement in the growing seasons of some agricultural products or the tourism season. But climate doesn't stop changing once you have your optimal conditions are reached, right? So climate continues to change. And so the key challenge then is to make institutions that already deal with the underlying inefficiencies in the transportation sector, in the energy sector, in the education sector, wherever it is, make them more efficient and more effective in what they're supposed to do anyways, so that we're better prepared with regard to climate change. And so let me close just with a few quick comments on cities, which is sort of the big theme of this meeting here. So in many ways, urbanization helps cut on carbon emissions, helps cut down on energy consumption. People living closer together, less transportation required. If you take the average American in cities relative to those outside cities, we're about 1 to 2% more efficient in cities and outside cities. So it's not much, but there it is. So people say, well, urbanization, by putting people closer together, actually creates these efficiency opportunities. Well, that's true to the extent, as long as you don't use then your urban lifestyle to reach out further into the resource portfolios, if you wish, and ship over long distances the goods and services. So there is that aspect. And if you look at China, for example, the average urbanite there consumes about 80% more energy than people outside the cities. And of course, that has to do with differences in demographic structure and lifestyles and things of that nature in those developing cities. But that's where most of the growth in urbanization takes place. And so we're probably going to see, in part because of urbanization, increases in carbon emissions for quite a time to come. But cities are also the places where most of the people live around the globe. More than 50% now live there. This is where most of the GDP gets generated. This is where most of the assets are at risk. So if we can get a hand on what to do with cities, we're in a much better position to deal with climate change in general. And then last but not least, one of the key challenges has to do with the fact that we're really unable, it seems, to close this gap between recognizing a problem and implementing a solution. Here in Boston, sea level rise, flooding, those kinds of issues have been known for decades. It's just about now that we're beginning to think about coastal zone development and all kinds of other infrastructure development to make us more resilient with regard to coastal flooding and other kinds of water-related challenges. Heat island effects and droughts and heat waves are really not an issue for Boston yet, but we know that in about 20 to 50 years that will be a big issue. So we got a window of opportunity to act, and we're not going to do it. So a real key challenge to become much more resilient for cities in the light of climate change is to begin to close that gap between recognizing the problem and actually doing something about this. So clearly, whoever conceived of the theme for this meeting had their fingers on the pulse of a really interesting set of challenges, how to get law and lawyers and the civil community and civil society in general engaged in this. There's a lot that we know we can do, and we can't do everything in this morning session, I know, but there is the afternoon session, so. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Scanlon. I'm the Associate Dean of the Environmental Program at Vermont Law School, and really happy to be here today. I thought this morning's conversation with Carol Browner was fascinating and tees up so many issues of this conference, and ties in naturally to what I'm going to be talking to you about, which is managing urban stormwater. And specifically, we heard from Carol Browner about the role of science in policy setting and some of the big issues that she tackled as administrator of EPA. And that is specifically the connection that I'm looking at related to urban stormwater, where we've had scientific breakthroughs in monitoring that show us new things about cities and problems with urban infrastructure that I'm going to talk to you about. And looking at where the disconnect is between scientific discovery and the Clean Water Act's ability to provide a framework for water managers to respond effectively. So I'll talk you through some of the science, the Clean Water Act, how it's set up related to urban stormwater, a study that I did with Professor Steph Tai about how science is incorporated by stormwater managers, and touch on briefly some of the needed reforms. The afternoon's about solutions, but I'll just give an overview of that. So pathogens are the leading cause of impairments to most of the waters in the U.S., with the exception of lakes. They're a top 10 cause of impairments for lakes, but the leading cause for all the other water bodies in the U.S. And pathogens can sicken people. So they're associated with sewage, contamination, human contact with pathogens from fecal matter in sewage results in intestinal illness and fever. And these kind of images of sick people related to contact with sewage, we usually think of as associated with developing countries who don't have access to sanitary sewage or water infrastructure. But this is a story that we're seeing over and over in the US today. And what's allowing us to see that connection between illness and sewage getting into places where it shouldn't be is this advance in genetic bacterial monitoring that can be done now, where scientists can actually tell you the source of bacteria. In the past, we just knew that waters were contaminated with bacteria and pathogens. We didn't know if it was coming from a squirrel, a dog, a human being. Now we can actually pinpoint it. And we're finding that human sewage is winding up in places where it shouldn't be. So the way cities are constructed, and I'm glad we're not having a lunchtime conversation about it. The way cities are constructed typically is that you have pipes that carry sewage to sewage treatment plants, and you have pipes that carry stormwater untreated out to just discharging into water bodies. There are older cities that combine those pipes, but in places where they're separated, you should be having totally separated systems. And what we're seeing through testing of stormwater discharge pipes that are the untreated, should be entirely just rain and melting snow coming off city streets. We're seeing human sewage showing up in those discharges because we're finding through this new technique that human bacteria is present. So that is a window into aging infrastructure and issues that we often don't realize are happening or even think about. So these are scientists who are studying this all across the US and in Australia and finding high levels of human bacteria in stormwater. So I just list out the studies for you here. How does the Clean Water Act work related to stormwater? Well, there are traditional NIPDES permits. These are the wastewater treatment permits for industries and sewage treatment. There's end-of-pipe technology, there's monitoring, clearly enforceable limits. And then we have urban stormwater. It's treated differently. It's a more iterative process than prescriptive. There are no real federal end-of-pipe limits. There's just management practices that are prescribed. And there is an illicit discharge program that's required. Of course, sewage getting into stormwater would be an illicit discharge. But it's really broad and very highly discretionary. The EPA requires merely that municipalities have a program. So what that led Stephanie Ty and I to study was this disconnect where we took a study area, the urban areas feeding into the city of Milwaukee, where one of the scientists had collected this large body of data about stormwater discharges and showing human bacteria in stormwater discharges. In over 50% of the samples in stormwater outfalls in the urbanized area of Milwaukee and the MS4s feeding into it, there was human bacteria. And yet, we didn't see any enforcement actions against those MS4s, they're called, the municipal wastewater treatment plants. And we also didn't see any real voluntary action by the managers. And so that got us thinking about why is there this disconnect? We constructed a study where I interviewed stormwater managers at all of these MS4s to try to understand what was happening with the law. And what came out of that were findings about how ossified the Clean Water Act is. And you heard about the role of science in the EPA administrators setting regulations. Well, what happens in these smaller programs, ones that maybe aren't as high profile, like stormwater pollution, is that you have scientific advances that aren't getting incorporated into the law, and so they're not trickling down to the managers who have to implement the programs. And when you have a disconnect like that, it leads to a state of knowledge being frozen. You have a recognition on one side of EPA regulators saying these programs don't really match anymore what we know the problems are, and yet a lack of an inertia and an inability to move forward. The program focus really needs to evolve to recognize that we have aging infrastructure problems that are leading to these cross-contamination between sewage and stormwater and leading to raw sewage being discharged into urban waterways that huge population centers are potentially exposed to. And for stormwater, the EPA really should be directing MS4s to do some tiered testing of bacteria, where if bacteria is present, they go quickly to human-specific testing to quickly determine whether or not you have a potential public health consideration and threat with human sewage getting untreated and put into urban rivers and streams. And we also found through this research that the EPA has to take a much more active role in monitoring scientific developments and creating an iterative process where science is being incorporated into changes in the law. Because otherwise we can have these situations like we have with urban stormwater, where public dollars are not really being spent efficiently. And they're not being put to the highest problem. For example, in this situation, if we're just testing for bacteria generically, we don't know the source, an urban stormwater system might think, we've got a problem with bacteria, let's have a pet waste control program to solve that. If they had human-specific testing and they realized it's not pets, it's a sewage pipe that's directly discharging into your stormwater, they could more quickly direct public dollars into fixing the real problem instead of programs that will never address the problems that are under the ground and unseen. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. If you are interested in this topic and you want more details about it, we have a paper that's published in the UCLA Journal of Environmental Law and Policy, and I imagine there are conference proceedings from this, so there's a link to the paper here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Zach Corrigan. I'm Senior Staff Attorney for Food and Water Watch. I have been charged with the unenviable task of talking about food and food policy in all about 8 minutes. Not an easy task, but let me start with a brief introduction of who I am, what my organization does, what we see as the biggest environmental challenges with the food system, and touch upon some of these issues. So I graduated from Northeastern University School of Law in 2002 and moved to Washington, D.C., which we all heard about was a horribly broken city from Carol Browner, if we didn't know this already. I worked as an advocate for the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, or U.S. PIRG, which is now Environment America, working on air pollution, global warming, and energy issues. My first campaign was to fight the senior citizen death discount, so I was glad that this is still being talked about. But my particular focus was on mercury contamination from coal-burning power plants. And so this was very much my first exposure to food issues. It was from an environmental perspective, and it continues to be so. After this, I worked for Public Citizen on fish farming issues. I continued to work on those issues after Food and Water Watch spun off of Public Citizen. Food and Water Watch is a national nonprofit consumer organization that advocates against the corporate control and abuse of our food and water resources. My responsibilities are to do all legal research, writing, and litigation to advance the campaign work for Food and Water Watch's food, water, and common resources teams. Perhaps I think the biggest challenge for cities with food is the growing disconnect between what people want from the food system and how it actually operates. What we have seen in the past 10 years is the growing movement by consumers who not only want to have a food system that delivers safe food, but also a food system that delivers healthy, sustainable, and justly produced food. In the most recent study I've seen, about 74% of Americans prioritize locally produced food, and 67% prioritize non-genetically modified food. But our food system couldn't be designed any more in polar opposites from these ideals. Instead, it is designed to deliver cheap, often unhealthy, unjust food thousands of miles, notwithstanding the environmental consequences. So to talk about some of these consequences. Various food policies, including those that have eliminated agricultural price supports and encouraged the sale of commodities for export, plus the massive consolidation in the retail and processing sectors, have pushed farms to either get big or get out. There were 6.8 million farms in 1935. We know the population of the United States in 1935 versus now. Despite this huge growth in population, right now there are a third that many farms in the United States. Those farms that do exist have been pressured to focus on single crops that can be grown outside of communities as part of processed food, and internationally to very large food manufacturers. Large factory farms pose a number of problems, too many for me to go into here, but they include water and air pollution. Just as an example, the 464,000 dairy cattle in Tulare County, California, as one example, produce 5 times more waste than all the people in New York City in the greater metropolitan area. Another public health problem is the growing use and abuse of antibiotics given to animals at very low levels or subtherapeutic levels, simply to increase growth rates of these animals. 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are now used in the agricultural sector. And as a result, factory farms are breeding resistant bacteria and contributing to human antibiotic resistance. Due in part to food industry's overseas shift to manufacturing plants where labor and environmental standards are lower, the average U.S. food product now travels 1,500 to 2,500 miles before reaching our dinner table. This leads to increases in carbon pollution. Our food distribution system emits 5 to 17 times more CO2 than a system that would be regional or local. Meanwhile, consolidation at the retail and processor side have had a tremendous cost for farmers and not necessarily reduced retail prices. Farmers sell into a hyper-consolidated market where just 20 companies now produce most of the food eaten by Americans, even organic brands. And only 4 retailers sell 50% of the food in grocery stores. 1 out of $3 goes to Walmart in the United States. And this hasn't necessarily led to cheaper prices for consumers or had overall better results for those who are producing the food. And Iowa is a great example with the pork industry. In Iowa, the biggest 4 packers slaughter 9 out of 10 hogs. The average size Iowa hog farm has increased tenfold since 1982. And over the past 3 decades, Iowa counties that have sold the most hogs have actually had declining incomes, while retail pork prices have nonetheless increased substantially. In many urban areas, and we are focused on cities, supermarkets have been pushing out independently run markets and then abandoned local communities for more lucrative suburbs, leaving residents with no other places to buy their food than convenience stores and fast food chains. And since 1996, the introduction of genetically modified engineered traits, GE foods have been embraced as an environmentally responsible, profitable way to sell food. But genetically engineered plants and animals do not perform better than their traditional counterparts. More and more science is concluding this, and they raise a slew of health, environmental, and ethical problems. So in the end, you have a structure of our food system that is designed to provide food to Americans in an unsustainable, unhealthy, and unjust manner. The question is now, well, what can we do about this? And how can we who live in the cities, I live in DC, and lawyers in particular, work to change the system? I think the easiest thing for people to gravitate is to just vote with your pocketbook. I love my local farmer's market. I trip every week, just about as much as anybody else. And there are opportunities for lawyers to get involved to increase the amount of food sold locally. For example, transactional attorneys are needed to assist consumer support, CSAs in agreements, as well as assist farmers markets and other food hubs to navigate the often tangled issues in formation and risk management. I'll talk about these in a second. But there are several problems with solely focused on increasing the opportunity for consumers to buy locally. First of all, 93% of all food sold in supermarkets is from big farms. Over half of the food that is sold locally is by farms who are located in the major metropolitan areas. So this means that even if small farmers, many whom sell commodities such as corn and grain, which do not sell very easy at farmers markets, wanted to sell more locally, they wouldn't be able to do so without dramatic changes in distribution chains, which are also dominated by large companies. So I think it's important for lawyers, those of us in the cities, to really focus at ways to fundamentally change the food system, particularly to reduce the corporate stranglehold on food production, processing, and retail. And there are opportunities to do it. I want to talk about one of my most recent cases, fascinating case, and it has to do with country of origin labeling. You might have seen it on the back of your food products. It says product of the United States or product of Canada. This is a great way for consumers to ensure that the food that they buy is not from overseas and is produced as locally as at least the nation. And it's also valuable because it allows U.S. cattlemen to kind of break the oligopolistic hold of the meat packers because they're able to sell their product at a premium when it's produced in the United States. But there are lots of problems with this law, and it has lots of loopholes. Under the Bush administration, for example, the rules were created so that cows that were born or raised outside of the United States could be combined with cows that were born and raised in the United States, and as long as those cows are all slaughtered on the same day, the product on the food, the label on the food would say product of foreign country, comma, product of US, which I don't know what that means when I see it on product. Is it from one country or is it from the other? Is it from both? If it's on a meat container, I have no idea what those labels mean. Largely due to a WTO ruling, the Obama administration has now changed the rules to ban this commingling practice and require that meat commodities be labeled where the product is born, raised, and slaughtered. Well, the meat packers, the American Meat Institute, who represents a very large meat industry, did not like this, and they sued the Obama administration, saying that the new labels violated their First Amendment rights because it was compelled speech and that it was ultra-virus. In an unusual move for us, we actually stepped in to defend the USDA, acted as interveners to defend the rules. And we won at the district court level. The district court denied the preliminary injunction. The case is now before the DC Circuit. This is a great example of consumers groups whose constituencies tend to be mostly urban, teaming up with rural constituencies to fight the oligopolistic market position of the meat packers. That's at the federal level. I have a state and local example, and then I will move on. At the state level, legislators have been increasingly involved in measures that would fundamentally change the food system. Right now, there are 29 states, including Massachusetts, that are considering labeling GE foods. It's a great opportunity for lawyers to get involved, change the system. And locally, there are moves to increase the amount of food sold locally. Boston just passed an ordinance, Article 89, which allows farmers, explicitly lays out what kind of farms Bostonians are allowed to start. This is a great opportunity for these vacant lots to be used to turn them into workable gardens. In conclusion, I would say that there are opportunities, great opportunities for lawyers in the cities to change the way that our food system works. And that will require both it looking locally to increase the opportunities for locally sourced product, but also looking externally to constituencies in rural areas, teaming up with them to make sure that our food is more sustainably produced, justly produced, and of course healthy.
So we've heard from Matthias that the storm is coming, and an umbrella is not enough. We've heard from Melissa, it's a shitstorm. We've heard from Zach that what we eat may be no better than what we excrete, but it's a little better if we know where's the beef from. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Sustainable Cities focus and draw on our practice at Clayton's Law Group, which is really on a day-to-day basis trying to be transactional lawyers for the environment. A lot of it in transactions working in and around cities and towns. So it's clear that we have many challenges. Here are some of the institutional hurdles that stand in the way of implementing some solutions, but also provide some great opportunity for creative, energetic, mission-oriented lawyers. Appropriations rules. In general, municipal officials, and I'm going to talk a little more from the Massachusetts perspective, can't incur liabilities in excess of an appropriation, which is done annually. How in the world do you enter into a 10 to 20 year energy savings or power purchase agreement? Municipal debt limitations. You've got millions of dollars of repairs in a municipality that need to be done to keep storm sewers and sewage systems separate. It will save on defense of EPA enforcement. It will improve life in the cities. But how do you raise that money? And do you need a debt override? Property tax limitations. This hits you up and down. You can't increase taxes beyond a certain limit, even to save money in the future. At least in Massachusetts with Prop 2.5. Nor can you give a tax break to a solar facility if your community wants to support and incent installation of, say, a large ground mount solar facility in your city. Public procurement rules. Competitive procurement can be very useful and be fantastic good government. But it can also slow things down and result in lost opportunities. Municipal authority limitations. I worked some years back with a public entity that was interested in purchasing a conventional power plant through a municipal debt financing, and then taking that power plant and cleaning it up, operating it on a break-even basis in a much more environmentally sound manner. But it turned out it was bedeviling to figure out in Massachusetts whether in this case a municipal entity could even own a conventional power plant without being what's called a municipal light plant, which carried all sorts of other things. And there haven't been new municipal light plants in Massachusetts since the 20s. Constitutional limitations. So it may make a lot of sense to have strict resiliency rules in new flood zones that keep getting worse and scarier every year. But what about regulatory takings limitations? Procedural obstacles. We're often in situations where we've got a gung-ho renewable energy committee in a town, a supportive board of selectmen. Everybody's ready to sign an agreement for a town to buy solar power for the next 20 years. but we have to wait 8 months for town meeting approval because there's only one town meeting a year. Limited knowledge. There are many things that cities can do to reduce their carbon footprint, but often they involve specialized knowledge. If you're a municipal purchasing officer, looking at a 30-page energy performance contract with complicated provisions about auditing and baseline and performance guarantees and indemnifications and so on, how do you approach that? It's nothing like you see in your day-to-day world. And then there are limited resources. What you really need if you're that purchasing agent is expert help from the outside. But what if saving $1 million over 10 years requires spending $10,000 to $20,000 now on expert consultants and lawyers? Bureaucracy. So we were this close to having the first community wind project sited on a town watershed property in, I think it was 2007. But it required, this was supported through, I think, 3 successive unanimous town meeting votes. The land was controlled by the Board of Water Commissioners, staffed by a small number of retired, mostly professionals, no experience with energy or environmental matters. They killed the project. We do water. We protect our watershed. We don't do wind. It's not our job. Political obstacles. So another recent anecdote. We had a mayor of a city that was very interested in doing a long-term solar energy purchase agreement that was going to save millions of dollars for the city, it was predicted, but wouldn't act independently without approval of the city council. Because what if the agreement didn't quite turn out as expected, and that harmed his political prospects? But he wouldn't go to the city council either, because damned if I'm going to let them tell me what to do. So the deal died. Inertia and fear. Significant community wind development in Massachusetts is now almost all but dead because of gripping fear about the impacts of wind energy equipment on neighbors, on property values, noise impacts, alleged impacts from infrasound, and so on. I've been to community meetings where all sorts of horribles are talked about, even though there's almost no scientific evidence of that sort of thing. And where people who are engaged in these heated debates are sitting just single-digit miles from a nuclear power plant that could be the next Fukushima. So what do cities do about this? Municipalities are complex. They wear so many hats and play so many different roles. But that also leads to some opportunities. So as regulators, I'm going to present this as a series of questions. Could you pass a building code that requires new buildings to be more energy efficient? As planners, could you rezone? Could you rezone and have a planning process to move development away from flood zones? Could a city purchase recycled paper goods? Could they install a new combined heat and power system to save energy? What about reorienting pension investments away from carbon-intensive industries? What about sponsoring a community garden or community shared solar facility or providing curbside single-stream recycling? What about using revenue bonds and using the proceeds to make low-interest loans to residents and businesses that are repaid through the property tax system? Could the mayor hold a sustainability summit? Could the mayor challenge all the kids in school in the city to have a science fair and come up with the next way to save energy and the environment? Could a city water authority gather more data through existing or better water meters and leverage that data to promote water conservation? Could a city pilot sustainability policies and then help other cities do the same? The last towns we'll talk about is sustainable lawyering. There is no such thing as a sustainable lawyer. There are areas of sustainability. There are certainly areas of legal practice that strike a little bit closer to home. You know, things I've talked about will touch on municipal law, environmental law, land use law, energy law. But there's so much more. Thinking about what Dean Paul said at the beginning, you just want to build a bridge. But what's the problem, and what are all the expertises that need to be applied to that? So sustainable lawyering requires government contracting expertise, corporate law, real estate law, construction law, public finance law, tax law, litigation, and so much more. So the punchline is sustainability cities need you, all of you. Thank you.
Out there, who would like to ask a question? Mr. Beckman, you have to make it very short.
I'll speak shortly. My name is Irving Backman. I'm a 1951, I think, graduate of the law school before it closed down for a few years. And I've been involved in environmental, what have you, for the past 40 or 50 years. And almost every one of the speakers today, I could almost get up and shout and say, I agree with you, I agree with you. But we have been involved in the business end of helping develop and fund new technologies. And I don't want to go through all of the different things, but there are kids in the basement, people from overseas and so forth that have developed new technologies, whether it's cleaning up the water, whether it's cleaning up the air pollution, whether it's cleaning up all the things that you've talked about, and even growing food more productively, growing it locally, and growing it fully sustainable without the use of chemicals and so forth. We started an organization a number of years ago called the DTT Group, which was developers of disruptive technology. And that's the kiss of death, because the disruptive technology dealing with alternative energy, of course, the oil and gas industries blocked everything. Cleaning water, the chemical industries, whether it was Dow or Monsanto and so forth. Even here at, right here in the city of Boston, I don't know if you know, there's a nuclear power plant existing here, and part of the problems there were the dirty water that comes from the cooling towers and from all the chemicals used, and that's every cooling tower in the city or what have you. New York just had a expose by the New York Times where they examined the cooling towers of, I don't remember the number, say 15 buildings, and 10 of them had listeria and salmonella and all kinds of pathogens at the bottom of their tanks, and that was exposed to
Question also for the panel, or do I have to steal the microphone?
well, the question is, how can attorneys be more helpful in advocating what may not fall under traditional rules? Because the traditional rules of EPA or the various states and so forth don't allow that because it wasn't known at the time.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me see if I can pitch that to which one of our panelists would like to tackle that.
quick answer for you, which is that so much of food policy is handled at the federal level. It can be handled at the state level. So the question, and for this conference, is what can cities do to impact federal and state policy? Cities are moving to pass resolutions that fundamentally affect our food system, if not by just sending a message. So we worked with Green Corps this last year to pass 7 municipal resolutions calling on the federal government to ban the subtherapeutic use and abuse of antibiotics. The first one passed was just this fall in Providence, Rhode Island. So I think that gets at what your point, which is that even though it doesn't have jurisdiction, Providence doesn't have jurisdiction over antibiotics, it can send a very strong message outside the system to change the way our food is produced.
Thank you so much. Is there another question or thought out there?
This is just a quick one for Melissa. Oh, I'm Jim Buchel. I'm a graduate of the law school. You have caused me to take a second look at an event that I experienced probably 35 years ago. I represent a lot of community groups that develop affordable housing, and I got a frantic call from my client when a project here in the city was just being finished. We were waiting for the occupancy permit to be issued. She called to say, "Jim, you've got to help come out to the site quickly. I'm being held up here. The inspector says I need a downspout permit." There was no such requirement in those days, of course, and this was some city official, some city inspector looking for a little incentive to issue what he was obligated to issue anyhow. But I'm now thinking maybe that person was way ahead of his time. Maybe stormwater was on his mind, I don't know. But the quick question for you is, the pathogens you're talking about that enter the separated stormwater systems, what's the source? Do you know what's the most common source?
So glad you asked that, because after I sat down and I realized I condensed an hour talk down to 10 minutes and skipped that. So the two most common ways that human sewage is entering storm pipes fall into two different categories. One would be direct piping from a sanitary sewer into a storm sewer, which would be a mistake or an intentional issue. And surprisingly, even with new construction in Milwaukee, while I was conducting this study, there were several incidences that arose where plumbers were directly piping sanitary sewage into storm sewers. The other way, which I think is more pervasive and harder to identify, is cracked pipes, leaky pipes, both on the sewage side and on the storm side. And engineers will tell you that the sewage pipes are supposed to be buried lower than the storm pipes. So technically, sewage should not be leaking even with cracks in both sets of pipes, but the maps are not accurate. Sewage pipes are sometimes placed above the storm pipes, and when there are cracks in both of them, there are leaks of sewage that are getting into the storm pipes. And that's a lot more difficult to fix because it's just throughout the city.
Thank you so much. So my main role here, right, is to keep us on schedule, which means I hope the conversations will continue now. We're going to break.
I'm going to give very brief introductions and then refer you to the conference program, which gives you much more detail about each of their really extraordinary qualifications to discuss this issue. So Jane is the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs and Research Professor and Director for the Urban Landscape Program in the College of Arts, Media, and Design here at Northeastern University. That, I think, is a longer title than I've ever read for anyone before. And after her will be Catherine Farrell, who is a 1973 graduate of the law school and also a former general counsel of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. Welcome, Catherine. And then following her, and here's a change in the program, is Robert Gittens, class of 1978, and
Vice President?
for your official title, yes. So Vice President for Public Affairs. I apologize. I've known Bob for so long that I haven't actually really thought about him as having an official title, but here we are. It's actually intended entirely as a compliment. And then finally, Elise Cherry, who's a 1983 graduate and Chief Executive Officer of the Boston Community Capital. So the question that we asked each of these speakers to focus on was really the question that that invokes the title of this conference, the lawyering question, and to try to give them something to really focus on in the approximately 8 minutes they each have. We asked them to talk to us about what 1 or 2 lessons or suggestions they would offer in answer to the following question. What can we do as a community, as lawyers, as people living in a beautiful city, to help engage in longer-term planning? We're looking more towards 2050 rather than just towards 2015 to make city life more sustainable. So, with that,
it's a pleasure to be here, particularly an honor because I'm not an alum, I'm not a lawyer. My father's a lawyer, so perhaps that qualifies me. I am an urban designer, and I think that there are many important overlaps between the way that we understand through regulation and the way that we understand through design the public landscape of the city. And I'd like to start with a slide, I hope you can see that up there, of terms which are probably relatively unfamiliar to most of us. And these are from a list of the top 20 most popular jobs by 2030 as predicted in a study from The Guardian. This points to significant change in our cities, probably change in physical arrangements, change in legislative regulation, change in urban policy. As populations shift, we are going to have new urban habits. This will necessitate new organizations for communities. All of this calls for rethinking the way that we design. And of course, when we rethink the way that we design and plan and manage cities, we need to be in partnership with those who actually provide the muscle behind that, those who produce and back up the regulation that determines the building and the design. So I'm going to blame it on you if it doesn't go well in the next couple of years. I'd like to take a moment to differentiate between urban resilience and urban sustainability. And this is a bit of nitpicking, but I think it's really important when we consider lawyering for a sustainable city. Traditionally, if you start on the left-hand side of this diagram, we've understood sustainability as a set of human systems through actions and interventions as you go through the top of the diagram, calling on environments, calling on ecosystems to produce goods, whether it's fuel, whether it's food, goods and services. When that equation balances, we consider a city to be sustainable. But if we step back, because that equation can shift abruptly, and ask how can we become less vulnerable to interruptions in our sustainable balance, the term resilience comes in. And resilience allows us to be comfortable with a reversal in this diagram. That is, it allows us to understand how environments, ecosystems, on the right-hand side of this diagram, through their actions and interventions, to change the way that human systems work in a city. Hurricane Sandy is a simple example of an environmental action and intervention rapidly changing the functionality, the productivity, and security of our human systems in a city. So sustainability perhaps is a set of questions in the near term. Resilience may be a set of questions that we need to embrace as a culture as a whole for longer term viability. A lot of current research points to the city region as a locus of response, adaptation, and innovation in urban environments. Why is this? A large part is because climate effectivity really happens locally and regionally. Of course, economic and demographic trends tend to happen or coalesce more at their regional scale. This is a good thing for cities because cities can, in many ways, be more agile in their responsiveness to change as opposed to state level or federal level. Two thoughts for the long term, given this background. One is that we need to find ways through design, through engagement with related fields, to allow our public spaces to be both multitasking and interconnected. By multitasking, we're talking about a new kind of public space, well, new to us in this generation. Of course, we used to design this way several centuries ago. We're talking about public spaces which are not only about a single function such as catching a bus, but public spaces which allow people to access transit at the same time they're fulfilling cultural needs such as communication. At the same time they are perhaps filtering stormwater and decreasing particulate matter in the air. We can no longer afford to have spaces which carry singular functions or even dual functions. Interconnectedness is similar in that we can't afford simply to allow our urban spaces, our urban terrain, to be thought of or managed or legislated in a singular manner. We have to understand our public space and systems as a series of interconnected moments, a series of constellated relationships. As an example of multitasking nationally and globally, I show two projects in the works here, and just very briefly, both of these projects are about the control and management of water. The scale at the left is one of the urban plaza, the scale at the right is one of an entire city. Both of these design proposals allow water to be filtered through public space in a way that not only doesn't interrupt, but actually increases the functionality of public space exchange. Interconnectedness can be illustrated by a current project for waterfront revitalization in the city of Toronto. They're really very much at the forefront of this. Here we see there's a call for a single space which would become underutilized through a change in zoning. Over a 6-year period, it actually galvanized a reworking of the entire mileage of the urban waterfront, including backing up through their regional watershed. This is pretty impressive. And over time, the benefits of tackling the waterfront as a whole, although it takes longer, thinking of it in an interconnected manner actually increases the economic development benefits more rapidly once it's underway, once it gains momentum. And in the end, our goal is both, of course. We want interconnected public space, we want multitasking public space. Both of these, and particularly to achieve them together, call for change in design, planning, and legislation. The High Line in New York City, I'm sure a number of you have visited this location, incredibly popular with visitors, almost to the detriment of the quality of those who actually live in the Chelsea neighborhood. Nonetheless, we really hold it up as a shining example of contemporary urban design that has achieved multitasking and interconnectedness. I can give you a 3-hour lecture on that, but I won't. So let's zero in briefly to Boston. Boston is, and use it as a vehicle to really get at this multitasking and interconnectedness. Boston, of course, has never been afraid of reshaping its ground plane. If we go back to the 1600s, this has always been at the heart of how we create economic viability and expansion of social programming in the city. Looking forward, of course, we are still going to need to think about and rely upon the condition of the ground plane based on climate change. Now, we need to understand the ground plane, of course, is completely built out at this point in time, but with shifts in something as simple as porosity, we can allow multitasking and interconnectivity to occur. Boston is already doing a really good job in some aspects. Perhaps some of you in this room have been involved with the creation of the Boston Complete Streets guidelines. This is a national model for allowing streets to be multitasking and to be interconnected. But we need at this point to go much further in perhaps our creative approach to the project. Here is an example of current faculty and student research, reimagining the ground plane as a place which not only supports single uses such as asphalt-covered parking lots, but can accommodate parking at the same time it accommodates farmers markets, at the same time it accommodates perhaps biofuel production. Just this past semester here in Northeastern, our faculty and students have been producing prototypes of ecosystem services for the land-water interface. This is an important reimagining of how we can return biological complexity and structural complexity to the shoreline of parts of the Massachusetts coastline and the Boston waterfront. Imagine that contaminated water plus a fairly, a fairly scraped away surface of the shoreline doesn't allow for a lot of inhabitation by aquatic or terrestrial life. If we reintroduce structural complexity, we can gain a lot of the resilience and sustainability back into the system. This sort of design thinking can operate at the unit scale of 1-to-1. It can also operate at a regional scale. So this could be a representation of a narrow strip along the urban shoreline, or simply a single unit within that. The end goal, of course, is to achieve adaptability, using multitasking, using interconnectedness. We're not trying to solve a single problem moving forward. We're trying to set up a framework that allows the city, and particularly the coastline, to be adaptive. Other current work includes reintroducing urban forests within the city of Boston. This is a piece from reprogramming the city from the Boston Society of Architects. Fairly affordable, very accessible, provides some co-benefits such as reduced heat island effect, places to have lunch. It also really reduces the amount of stormwater that hits impervious surfaces and improves air quality. A colleague of mine here at Northeastern, Dan Adams, is just opened a project in the Fort Point Channel area. It is the underpass of I-93 through illumination techniques and revising temporarily, we think, the way that design codes are allowed to operate in this temporary installation. I shouldn't speak about this too broadly. He has been able to reconnect parts of the city which were separated from one another for quite a period of time. This is now open to bicyclists and pedestrians, and I have 0 minutes left. So I'd like to ask you to think with designers, hand in hand, what the cities that we love will look like in the future, how they will work as something as straightforward as job types change to something as complex as climate change. Who will live in our cities? Who will pay for them? I often end my questions with how does design thinking prepare us for the future? But I'd like to ask you how evolving urban policies and regulations make this sustainable and resilient future possible. It can obviously only be achieved through engagement of multiple and interdisciplinary teams. Urban design is not a simple endeavor anymore, not that it ever was, but it is now something which requires us to work with the law field, and we look forward to doing so here through Northeastern, and may our alumni work together.
It's great to be back here. I started here in 1970. Anyway, I'm to talk about my past career in environmental law and how that relates to now working on sustainable cities. I started Northeastern in 1970. It was the 3rd year of the new law school, full-time day program. In 1970, also the National Environmental Policy Act was just passed. The Clean Air Act was just passed, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was just passed. In addition, EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, was just created. So I went to Northeastern to become an environmental lawyer, and Northeastern was the perfect place for that. In my first year at Northeastern, we were encouraged to go out and find our own co-op jobs. There were not enough co-op jobs, so we went out to find them. And I contacted the Conservation Law Foundation here, a nonprofit that works on environmental advocacy. They said, sure, come on down, and I worked on wetland protection for my first co-op job. So then comes my 3rd year of law school. What am I going to do? I contacted the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Region 1 in Boston, and they said, okay, come on down, and I became a co-op student there. Luckily, fortunate to be asked back for a full-time job there. That was my first environmental law job. That was when I was working on the NEPTES program that Melissa was talking about this morning and enforcing the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. My second environmental law job was with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. I think we have some people here from there. It's a wonderful job, and I worked on enforcing Massachusetts state statutes. My third environmental law job, I'm going to stop eventually. My third environmental law job was with a state agency. I worked on drafting ocean sanctuary regulations and river protection regulations. Okay, and my fourth environmental law job, my favorite environmental law job, was on the Boston Harbor cleanup, and that was the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. Why was that my favorite? Well, we were a team of engineers, planners, and lawyers working on a magnificent project. We brought it in on time and under budget. You can see pictured above me those 12 things. Those are the sludge digesters, and that's where the sewage from all of us is digested and eventually made into fertilizer pellets. The methane gas from there is then reused in the plant to heat the plant. Okay, that's it for the past. So how does that relate to now? What does that transfer to 2014 to work on as a lawyer on sustainable cities? Got some ideas. First of all, I think we're still using all the same tools we always use that we know from law school. Statutes, regulations, policy, contracts, negotiation, litigation. And I have some ideas, and I think you've heard about a lot of them already. First of all, city government. I think it's really important that cities start enacting ordinances and working out energy efficiency. Lawyers are needed to do that. I know there are impediments that Jonathan talked about this morning. Secondly, zoning ordinances need to be rewritten to promote for smart growth. Third, cities have to become storm resilient. We need new development to be at a level where they'll withstand sea level rise and storm flooding. We also need the utilities to be put upstairs. Let's hope they're doing that at the Seaport District. Existing buildings need to be retrofitted. Okay, the Deer Island sewage treatment plant was, and you're talking about the year 2050, it was built 1.9 feet higher in order to provide for the storm level rise. That's the useful life of the plant. I'm not prepared to say what will happen then after that. Massachusetts has enacted the Massachusetts Green Communities Act. Cities can become a part of that and work on their energy efficiency. Cities can become part of Cities for Climate Protection. My hometown, Arlington, Massachusetts, is one, and we've developed a climate action plan where we're reducing our carbon emissions. Cambridge, Massachusetts recently became a net zero community. They're also working on their fossil fuel use. Somerville, Massachusetts has Somerville Vision, or Summer Vision. Okay, now let's move over to the private sector. Okay, I'm an intellectual property attorney. What can I do about sustainable cities? Well, I think you can. I think no matter what our title is, I think we all have a role here. And for example, I'll give you an example. You can work with your clients. Acme and Novartis recently joined in Cambridge the Community Compact for a Sustainable Future. And they're working with Cambridge, MIT, and Harvard to promote sustainable cities. All right, so now I'm a real estate lawyer. What can I do to promote sustainable cities? Well, I think we go back to law school. I think we're all trained to be part generalists. So you become an expert in regulations for incentives for sustainability. You also recognize issues, and you also work with a team. You know, you get engineers and planners to help you on this. And then, for example, if you're working on construction and development projects, make sure that they are LEED certified. Make sure they're green buildings. Try to promote with your clients energy efficiency. That will save them a lot of money over the useful life of the project. And I think your clients will appreciate it. So I think as lawyers, no matter what our specialty is, we've been taught to ask questions to our clients, and there's no reason why you can't ask them about sustainability. Let's switch over to nonprofits. Back to Conservation Law Foundation, where I started in 1970. They've been very active on sustainability issues. One example, in the Big Dig project, they were part of the whole settlement that required, through litigation and negotiation, that required that there be built the Silver Line, and now the Green Line is being extended to Route 16 in Somerville. My last and favorite idea. I'm retired, so now I'm an environmental and political volunteer. I'm a part of, in my hometown Arlington, the East Arlington Livable Streets Coalition. And we're working on Mass Avenue. We're trying to add bike lanes and pedestrian access. Another idea, volunteer for a political candidate. I volunteer for candidates that have strong environmental and climate change platforms. Run for political office. I think actually politics is probably the most important arena when it comes to sustainability. So I'm going to close and say in conclusion, there's plenty for lawyers to do in 2014 as there was in 1970.
My name is Bob Gittins, as you heard, and I work as Vice President of Public Affairs here at Northeastern University. And I had the chance to work with Ralph Martin, who he and I have been good friends since our first day of law school. Wasn't in this building, it was a different building and many, many decades ago, but we've been close friends ever since. I had a chance to work with him when he was district attorney for Suffolk County, and then we've come back together again here at Northeastern. He is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the university. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the work that we've done together with the university in going through the process of getting a new master plan for the university. But as I think about the role for lawyers in that process and those working with their clients, I think some of the lessons that I take from that experience is the opportunity for you as a lawyer to really be an advocate not only for your client, but to think broader in terms of how do I come up with a win-win situation. And the comments about the politics and how that plays a role in how things get done, especially in a regulatory system, become critically important. And so being able to think not only about what your client's interests are, but also having an understanding of what other players in the game may have as interests and how you can bring them together, I think is a skill that is definitely worth cultivating. Just to say a little bit about the university in terms of the university's focus on sustainability. It's one that has been a priority for Northeastern for many years. It's one that we focused on, and we have been fortunate enough to receive some recognition for the work that we've done. Just recently there was a survey of colleges and university campuses around the world. I believe there were 130 campuses that they looked at, and Northeastern came out as the third greenest from around the world. So it's a commitment that we have, and we are going to continue to follow through on that. And so part of that, it also involves looking at where we're going as a university into the future. And some of you may know that the city of Boston has a process by which institutions, whether they be hospitals, cultural institutions, or universities, think about their planning over a 10-year period. And we're all required to submit a master plan talking about what we propose to do in that period in terms of development and what we see as happening not only on campus, but what impact we have in the surrounding community. And as part of that effort, in part because we are a nonprofit, they're looking for what mitigation we can bring to the community. And so incorporated into the master plan is a community benefits package. And so that I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that is incorporated into that regulatory process is a discussion, a dialogue with the surrounding community. So the master plan that Northeastern submitted to the city, which was approved this past December, came as a result of a dialogue all across campus. All of the departments were asked about what their needs are, where they thought we had to focus our development needs going forward, what our priorities were going to be. And at the same time, we engaged in a comprehensive dialogue with the surrounding community. One way that we could have approached it was to say, you know, we are going to find a way to ensure that Northeastern gets what it wants with minimal impact on the surrounding community. And that's an approach that we could have taken. You know, as lawyers, we can advocate for our client and just try to cut the very best deal we can, say in monetary terms. But I think we took a different approach in thinking about how the long-term viability and sustainability in the communities around Northeastern's campus were also in the same interests of Northeastern. And so what could we do to not only build up the campus, but also look at ways in which we could enhance the community of which we are a part. And so as that process went along and we talked to a group that was convened, we had what was known as a community task force, and we asked them, what are the things that you see as opportunities for Northeastern to help out? So one of the task force members said, well, you know, one of the problems in the community is the playing field, the playground on Columbus Avenue. It is the William Carter Playground, which many of you may be familiar with. And this is the field that's, as you see it today. And people will tell you that it's a challenge because any significant rainstorm and it becomes just mud. And, you know, so it's, it really can't be used. And then the other factor is just the way it's designed limits the amount of use that it can get. And so we began looking at what is it that Northeastern can do to help make this a better environment for everybody involved. Now, it's a city-owned park, and that's not going to change. It is named for William E. Carter, and William E. Carter was an African-American soldier who fought in the Spanish-American War. He was also a soldier in World War I where he was killed in action. So it is named after him. I don't think we're going to change the name of this park if we care about politics with the community. But we did look at what was possible for us to do with this park. And so the idea is that we could take a portion of what is Northeastern University property. Let me go back to the previous slide. If you look at the top of the field, the part that is segmented, and it's obvious that it is a parking lot. That parking lot is actually Northeastern University property. The other part with the ball fields is owned by the city, but we reached an agreement with the city that we would contribute our portion of that area to be able to redesign the park. And so this will allow us to resurface the field. We'll be able to reconfigure it in a way that you can have multiple activities going on at the same time. We're going to be able to continue to have both baseball fields, football, soccer, lacrosse, continue to have the tennis courts, as well as an area for playing basketball. But it takes what is something that is a city field, and we're going to be able to contribute our land, and we're going to also enhance it by having public safety and provide security on the field, and we've also agreed that we would uphold the maintenance of the field as well. So this is something that is going to be an enhancement, not only for Northeastern teams that currently use it periodically, but certainly for the entire community. We'll be able to get our athletic department involved in working with kids from the surrounding community and make an enhancement for everybody involved. The other part that we have looked at is looking at ways in which we can connect parts of the surrounding community. So this is the way the campus looks today, with the railroad tracks cutting right through the center of the community. And it really is a barrier for people trying to get from one side to the other, and it feels like it's a barrier. And so that's something that's been a concern for everybody involved, and we decided there are ways that we can help connect parts of the Fenway community with parts of Roxbury. So, what we have talked about, what you see up there now, is the first development, building development that we've put forth in the master plan. It's known as the Integrated Science and Engineering Complex, but if you look at the back of that complex, you'll see going over the tracks what we have called the arc. And I will show you how it looks from the other side of campus. So the idea is to have a pathway that goes from one side of the campus to the other side, to the Roxbury side of campus, and to encourage folks to go back and forth between the communities. Northeastern's made a commitment to invest in the surrounding community. We are investing both in terms of a commitment to increase employment opportunities from people from the local community. We're going to increase the percentage of local employees who work at Northeastern. And if you're familiar with the way many institutions work today, it's not only those who work as Northeastern employees, but a lot of what we do on campus is done through vendors. And so we've engaged our vendors to also become part of that increase in local hiring. We have held a jobs fair on campus for the local community with Northeastern and for our vendors. It was I often start by saying it was a huge success. The sad part was 700 people showed up. That was 700 people who didn't have jobs, who were looking for jobs. So in some ways it's very bittersweet, but it was vendors came and brought jobs to offer folks, and folks got jobs out of that. We're going to do that again. We've committed $2.5 million to an entrepreneurial fund to promote the opportunity for people in businesses in the community to get funding to support that. We're going to leverage that money for other resources. And then we're increasing our commitment to working with minority and locally owned businesses in the community to do more with Northeastern as an institution. So we're thinking long-term in terms of what we see as Northeastern's role as an anchor institution in this community to promote viability not only on campus but in the communities around us. Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure to be back, and particularly a pleasure to be among so many members of the Northeastern University Law School community. I wanted to talk today a little bit. We've been hearing some very interesting work from my fellow panelists, and I wanted both to come up a level and down a level. And so I thought maybe I would just start by describing the earlier part of my day. I got up and after an early morning walk, went happily and productively to work in my kitchen. Courtesy, of course, of the extraordinary revolution that we've had in the ability to telecommunicate. When it came time to come over here, I left my home, perhaps a tad later than I might have imagined, and promptly ran into the local flock of wild turkeys, who had decided for reasons that are completely unclear to me to engage in a variety of activities in the middle of the road, non-negotiable. Then I kept coming along and came through the hospital area where I was again stalled by a giant dump truck, which was, I don't know, doing something with respect to the construction happening there. And then I ran into a horde of bicyclists, also non-negotiable. And I say that on both sides, when I'm a bicyclist and when I'm a driver, as far as I can tell, it's all completely non-negotiable. And so what I started to think about was, I graduated just over 30 years ago, and if anybody had said to me at that point, plan for what the city of Boston will look like in 30 years, I might have thought of the dump truck. The turkeys and the bicyclists and the ability to telecommunicate, not so much. And so you think about that, and we think about the ways in which we think about long-term planning, and then I think about the kinds of disruptive technologies that emerge, and I think that the power industry, both in terms of production and distribution, is overripe for disruptive technology. I hope one is coming with respect to transportation. And what you begin to think about is that for all the planning in the world, we don't really have any idea what the city is going to look like or what it's going to need in 30 years, right? Will we all be deciding to live out in the wilds of Vermont and telecommute entirely? Will we be focused in internal areas? Are we going to have, I think about Kendall Square, which is really the center of innovation, and the fact that there in the floodplain, if Sandy had come here, Kendall Square is underwater. What happens when all those things happen? And so when I think about all that and the ideas that we've been hearing this morning with respect to interconnectedness and multitasking and the role of nonprofits and so forth, what seems to me is that the absolute critical issue that we've also been talking about really is resilience. I mean, the truth of it is we can plan as well as we can, but in the end, the one thing we can be sure of is that we'll be wrong. And that what we've really got to be able to do is to be sufficiently resilient in order to manage the ways in which we have not been accurately able to predict what happens. So what does that mean? I mean, I don't actually think that what it means is we should all throw up our hands and keep going. Right? I think that there are lots and lots of things that we can do every single day, because the other thing I note now from this better than 30-year out vantage point is the future really is comprised of a whole lot of days that follow each other one after another, and the things that we do every single day in the end have an enormous impact on the decades. So I think of this right now from the perspective of I'm CEO of Boston Community Capital. We are I guess at this stage, fairly large-scale nonprofit. We have offices over in Dudley Square. We're actually moving also to Dudley Square, and because we think it's really important to be out in the neighborhoods. And so although I use legal skills every single day, what I think about as CEO of an organization like that is how to deal not just with the external kinds of programming that we do, but also with our own internal issues, right? How is it that we are good, strong, solid, responsible, and environmentally sound citizens? What can we do to recycle? What can we do to encourage people to reduce their carbon footprint, who are employees, our staff? What can we ourselves do to reduce our carbon footprint? All of those things repeating all over the Commonwealth. We heard, I thought Bob did a great job really describing all of Northeastern's efforts to do that. And that's happening all over the place, whether you're a large or whether you're a small employer, whether you're a for-profit or a not-for-profit employer, and really whether you're in a legal role or a CEO's role. I think there are very few people now who think about the decisions they make without thinking about the long-term impact on carbon footprint and on resiliency in the cities that we live in. And that has a lot of things go into that, right? You can think about how it is that you set up your workspace. You can also think about the ways in which you make it possible for people to have flexibility and to actually commute from their homes, to telecommute. All of that happens every single day. Then, of course, there's the actual work that we do out in the community. We are a community finance intermediary, but our mission is really to help build healthy communities where low-income people live and work. And we take a pretty broad view of that mission. And so we've got a couple of things going on that are explicit to resiliency, I think. One is we have a little company that we've developed and actually financed that we call WeGoWise. WeGo stands for water, electricity, gas, and oil. And what it does, it's a very low-cost approach to measuring utility outputs so that you can actually figure out how your property compares to other properties. We set this up in the first place because we were trying to help low-income communities figure out the actual benefits they were getting from conservation. The problem is somebody would come along and say, oh, we'll replace the windows or the heating system or the air handling system. And you never had any idea whether any of it actually helped or not. And so we created a low-cost solution to that. Then, of course, it turned out that once we created a low-cost solution, everybody else, low-income or not, thought that was a great idea too. We now have the largest database in the country for multifamily utility output, and we've been moving on to the commercial and industrial side too. We're actually the folks that lead users when they're trying to figure out whether conservation efforts have been successful. We have another entity that we call SEA, for Solar Energy Advantage, and Emily Rashan, who's here, works on that, and that is a way really to try and get solar out to low-income communities, and particularly to have it go out onto the roofs of affordable housing developments and nonprofits. So, for example, the Boston Food Bank, which has extraordinary energy needs because of their need for refrigeration, has 900 panels on their roof. So we have sun, which is our foreclosure relief thing. I sometimes say if we just get along to earth and air, we'll be retired here, but we're not quite there yet. But part of what we think about in the context of all that is really this notion of internal rate of return versus external rate of return. And we're all used to balance sheets in which organizations, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, measure the internal rate of return. But the truth is that all of us do, and all of our organizations do, a whole lot of stuff that actually impacts what, I think it was Jason Clay who originally coined the term, an external rate of return, meaning what is the benefit or burden in the broader society of what we do. So for example, if we pay absolutely no attention to carbon footprint, we in fact are imposing a burden. It's not on our balance sheet, but somebody's paying for it. That somebody being all of us, of course. By contrast, if we are careful about what we do and think about doing things like reducing impervious surface or reducing carbon footprint or reducing transportation needs or whatever it happens to be, then we're having a positive impact on that external rate of return. And so I guess part of what I would say is I would encourage all of us in whatever role, whether we're functioning in a management role as a CEO or whether we're functioning in a legal role, that part of the advice that we can offer and part of the decisions that we can really think about making have to do not just with the internal rate of return that shows up on our balance sheet and that we report either to stockholders or stakeholders about, but also to focus really on the external rate of return and begin to think about whether what it is that we're doing, again, particularly on the environmental side, has a positive or an adverse impact on the surrounding communities. Because 30 years goes by in a flash, as it turns out, and the things that we do every single day will really have an extraordinary impact on what the world looks like, not today, but in 2044, say. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to all four of you for those wonderful presentations. And we have a good chunk of time for questions and comments. So let's engage in some dialogue here. Questions? Comments?
Well, I just had a quick question about Northeastern work, and I was curious, you talked about like increasing jobs, which is...
Say who you are first.
Hi, my name is Monica Ramirez. I have a question about human capital building in surrounding areas. Are there any initiatives at Northeastern to increase or provide scholarships or do something about actually getting students around the areas and into Northeastern? So
several things. One is we're doing more in terms of working with the local community in terms of tutoring kids from the local community. That's okay. So we're working with kids in terms of tutoring and preparing them. Yeah, got it. And so as we work with that group of students, hopefully they'll be thinking about getting prepared to come to Northeastern. Another program we have is called Foundation Year. And if folks have followed the story in Boston about students who graduate from the Boston Public Schools, often going into community college, but having to take remedial courses and not getting credit for them and then using up their financial aid. Foundation Year is that first year of college, which it gives them remedial support, but it's done in a way that at the end of the year they get credit, full year's credit, that they can either go to another college or university. Not all of them stay at Northeastern, but some of them do, and some of them have been very successful. We're also increasing the number of scholarships that we're making available in the local community as well.
Hi, I'm Tracy Corley. I'm Sustainable Developments across North America. Is this whole conversation about internal rate of return versus external rate of return, and sometimes it's referred to as exchange value versus use value. So do any of you as panelists have any examples of how this external rate of return gets written into policy or regulations, or how that gets accounted for? I know that on the business side of things, there's the whole benefit corporation model, where you're kind of looking at what are the benefits to society that you can leverage instead of just looking solely at return to shareholders. But are there any policy integrations with this kind of concept that anyone's aware of?
You can also use the mic up there if that's easier.
I have them both on.
Oh, you can. I'm still learning.
Well, can you all hear me?
So it's a very interesting question. I think when Jason Clay first started focusing on this, what he was looking at was the reduction in diversity among wheat strains, because it's really easy to run a stock exchange and a futures exchange based on wheat if in fact it's all the same. The problem with having wheat be all the same is that when you lose the genetic diversity, you have much more risk of some sort of blight. In fact, Ethiopia is struggling with this right now. So but it's invisible. The cost of that is invisible. And so I think from the perspective of policy planners, that one of the things we need to really think about is taking account of the tax code in terms of doing some of this. So that if in fact part of the due diligence on looking at change was to say, does this have a positive or negative impact on external rates of return, and then use the tax code to encourage one direction or discourage the other direction, I think that would be terrific. At the moment, I don't think a whole lot of that is going on. But if I were to say, what's the best lever going forward for that, I really do think it's the tax code. I mean, we've sort of failed over the years of getting anything around limitations on carbon through that. But I think dealing with it in this broader sense of helping people to understand that the external rate of return really is something we all pay, right? And that putting it in those terms and then dealing with it in the tax code as a way to rejigger the question of who actually is paying and who's actually benefiting is certainly the route that I would think about going.
Any other comments from
I would say that from the perspective of a design community, there is much evidence of the past decade of increased interest from clients for sustainably built, sustainably evaluated buildings and landscapes in cities. So mechanisms such as the LEED evaluation system are ways, in some cases, for some points of evaluation, of dealing with external rates of return in fairly limited ways. And then I would say there's a history of legislation that impacts how and why we design, such as the Clean Water Act, that absolutely we could think of as a way of anticipating and managing external rates of return for single projects in the larger sphere. I wouldn't say it's always successful. And I also would say it's very much in need of renovation and innovation at this point in time. But I think when we consider the role of multitasking and interconnectedly motivated design, we are in the role of educating clients about it's not just what you win with your single project, it's what we can win in terms of your project within a given context, environmental and social.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Elena Mahali. I'm a legal fellow at the Conservation Law Foundation. Very happy to hear of your positive experience. This is a general question, but was triggered by something that you said, Catherine, about how we are using a lot of the same tools to try and tackle these sustainability issues, but we need more. And I'm wondering what, as a recent law grad myself, what tools you would advise young lawyers and law students to make sure that we come out of law school and the years after, make sure that we find mentors who are working in those areas to really, what are the best tools that we can equip ourselves with to, and new tools to tackle these problems.
Well, first of all, I think you're probably a lot more literate than I am with the computer, and I think that's an important tool. So keep that going and use that. I don't know that there are that many newer tools. I think it's the same old thing. I mean, I always found my job by someone I knew. And so, I mean, if it's, you know, you're talking jobs, or you're just talking...
I'm talking about tackling sustainability issues.
Okay, okay. Yeah, no, I think, I don't know that there's a whole new concept in the sense, I think we're approaching problems like we did in 1970. We had to figure out the tools then, we have to figure out the tools now. I mean, I think we're going to come up with different solutions, but we're going to use our same brains to come up with them, and our same arsenal as lawyers. You know, you got to learn the statutes, you got to be willing to sue, you've got to be willing to negotiate, you've got to reach out and make a team. You know, you've got to use all of those things. I think, though, there probably are some creative solutions that I haven't thought of.
Hi, I'm Irving Backman again, and you have talked of external rates of return and tax credits and so forth in order to implement some of the energy and conservation and sustainability methods that we're all looking for. Obviously, if you're a nonprofit organization, tax credits don't mean anything. And if you're a public school or university or whatever, you're laying off school teachers and libraries and policemen and so forth. So you're not looking for internal rates of return. You don't have the capital to put any of these new implements. What I'm thinking, listening, I'd love to see a dirty dozen group of the university organizing a group of 12 potential users of whether it's solar or wind or other forms of conservation or water pollution, where not only would they have them implement some of these sustainability projects, but if they're working with any kind of a legitimate firm, whether it's a GE or Honeywell or what have you, they would guarantee the performance of the particular project. So there would be no capital outlay by, say, Northeastern or the city of Boston or some other Raytheon or whatever the company would be, that here's an energy saving or here's a sustainability project, and you'll have no upfront costs because the Honeywell or the Raytheon or the GE that might install it would guarantee the savings, would guarantee enough savings that they would pay for the capital costs and get repaid by the savings. That is possible. What so many of people have talked about, how do you get sustainability? Who's going to pay for it? What's the internal rate of return? You can get some of the major corporations to guarantee their product and the performance will pay for the capital's cost. I'm saying you can get it, but that's something that's worth working for, and I'd be glad to work with some of the groups that could visualize what could be done in the local community, what could be done in a university, what can be done with the public schools that might have enough savings with the new type of technology or the new type of health product to make it worthwhile for a major manufacturer to say, we will install this without cost because if you pay us just for the energy savings, or we'll give you enough energy savings to pay for the cost.
Any final comments from our panelists? And we have to stop.
I would just say that, in fact, the tax code and tax credits are probably the single most important way that nonprofits both develop equity and develop new programs. So it requires a fair amount of structuring, but hey, that's what we all know how to do, right? Or eventually that's what we all figure out how to do. So I actually think that whether you're on the nonprofit side or the for-profit side, there are lots and lots of opportunities to take advantage of not just the spending side of the code, but also the credit side of the code in order to achieve sustainability and other kinds of resilience objectives. So perhaps that's a place to
Just one quick comment to pick up on what you were saying, and I know we have to close, but I think the type of thinking that you're suggesting is what's happening, not just in Northeastern, but other institutions as well, looking for those opportunities. When I was talking about what Northeastern has done, I didn't realize that Carol Roscom is in the room, who leads our sustainability effort here at Northeastern. But those types of collaborations among institutions and that type of negotiation with providers is something that is going on, saves us money in the long run. It's the right thing to do for everyone. So you're onto something important.
Thank you so much to our panel. Now we have an absolutely wonderful